I'm Cassidy, 33 years old. My mother screamed at me to get out of her house while the rest of my family stood by and cheered her on. I didn't cry and I didn't beg. Instead, the very next morning, I signed the title deed to an $87 million private island fortress, paid entirely in cash, and left them behind forever. Before I go any further, let me know in the comments where you are watching this video from. And if you've ever had to cut toxic family members out of your life just to protect your peace of mind, give this video a like and subscribe. The air inside the dining room of my parents' Connecticut estate was suffocatingly heavy, thick with the scent of roasted turkey and the nauseating stench of fake wealth. We were gathered for our annual Thanksgiving dinner, a tradition that had long since devolved into a stage for my family to flaunt their perceived superiority. I sat quietly at the far end of the long mahogany table, pushing a glazed carrot around my plate. At the head of the table sat my father, Richard. He was slowly nursing his third glass of expensive bourbon, nodding eagerly at every single word coming out of my brother-in-law's mouth. Jamal, my brother-in-law, was dominating the center of the room. He was a financial broker who never missed an opportunity to brag about how much money he claimed to be making. Tonight, he wore a tailored burgundy velvet suit that practically screamed new money, paired with a massive gold watch. Every time he reached for his wine glass, he made sure the watch caught the glare of the crystal chandelier. I just closed an offshore portfolio this morning, Jamal announced, leaning back in his chair with a smug grin. We're talking high-yield dividends, Richard, the kind of numbers that make your head spin. The firm is practically begging me to move into the corner executive suite now. My mother, Patricia, beamed at him from across the table. She adjusted her pearl necklace, a family heirloom she wore purely to remind everyone of our lineage. That is just wonderful, Jamal, she fawned. It's such a relief to have a true provider in the family, someone with real ambition and financial intelligence. She didn't even bother to hide the sharp look she shot in my direction. I kept my face completely blank and took a slow sip of my water, if they only knew the truth. My sister, Brittany, took the opportunity to join the attack. At 29, Brittany was the undisputed golden child of the family. She was currently pregnant with her first child, a fact she used to demand constant attention and accommodation. She placed a perfectly manicured hand over her stomach and sighed dramatically. It's honestly exhausting being married to someone so successful, Brittany said, batting her eyelashes at Jamal. But I guess someone has to bring home the real money. Tell me, Cassidy, are you still doing that computer nerd job? Or have you finally realized that sitting in a dark room typing lines of code is a dead end? I looked up from my plate, meeting my sister's condescending gaze. I am a cybersecurity architect, Brittany. I build defensive algorithms to secure data networks. She rolled her eyes and waved her hand dismissively. Right, whatever. It's just depressing watching you waste away. I mean, you're 33, you're completely single. You live in a cramped apartment and you spend your whole life staring at a screen. Do you even have a retirement plan, or are you just counting on mom and dad to support you forever? The irony in her voice was so thick I could almost taste it. For the past 5 years, my family had been living a massive lie. My father's manufacturing company was bleeding money, teetering on the edge of total collapse. My mother's lavish country club lifestyle was funded entirely by maxed-out credit cards. And Jamal, the self-proclaimed financial prodigy, was drowning in debt. I knew all of this because I was the one quietly shielding them from reality. Years ago, I set up an automated payment system to handle the massive mortgage on this very estate, solely to keep my parents from losing their home. They had brainwashed themselves into believing Richard's business was funding their lives, but the reality was that my boring computer job was their only safety net. Furthermore, my career wasn't just a job, it was an empire. Just 2 days before this miserable Thanksgiving dinner, I had finalized a deal to sell my proprietary defensive algorithms to a massive tech conglomerate. The acquisition price was $500 million. I was sitting at that table as one of the wealthiest women in the state, while my family mocked me in designer clothes they had likely rented. You really should listen to your sister Cassidy, my mother chimed in, her voice dripping with fake concern. It's embarrassing trying to explain to our friends what it is you do. When people ask about my daughters, I can spend hours talking about Brittany and Jamal. But you have no spouse, no assets, and no real future. You are a massive dark spot on this family's reputation. My father grunted in agreement, swirling the bourbon in his glass. You threw away a perfectly good path to medical school just to play on computers, he muttered. Look at Jamal. That's what success looks like. You should take notes. Jamal chuckled, a low, arrogant sound that grated on my nerves. Hey, not everyone is built for the big leagues, Richard. Some people are just meant to be worker bees. If you ever need a small loan to upgrade your laptop or whatever it is you use, Cass, just let me know. I can probably pull some pocket change from one of my minor accounts. I looked at Jamal, taking in the flashy suit, the arrogant posture, and the light sheen of sweat near his hairline. A man who is truly secure in his wealth doesn't sweat when he talks about money. I knew the symptoms of a failing finance guy. I also knew that men who bragged loudly about offshore portfolios usually had a regulatory investigation waiting for them down the road. I smiled softly, placing my napkin on the table. I appreciate the offer, Jamal, I said, my voice remarkably calm, but I think my laptop is running just fine for now. Brittany scoffed, resting her head on Jamal's shoulder. You're just stubborn, Cassidy. You'd rather live like a peasant than admit we're right. Honestly, your negative energy is completely ruining my pregnancy glow. I don't even know why we invited you this year. I leaned back in my chair, absorbing their insults, their condescension, and their blatant disrespect. They were sitting in a crumbling mansion, attacking the only person who had actually protected them, and they felt invincible. They thought I was weak because I chose silence over shouting. They thought my lack of designer labels meant a lack of value. They had absolutely no idea that the woman they were insulting could buy and sell their entire existence with a single phone call. I didn't argue. I didn't defend my career or my bank account. I just sat there, memorizing every cruel word, every smug look, and every arrogant laugh. The tension in the room was heavy, building toward a breaking point, and they were sprinting blindly toward it. They were setting the stage for their own downfall, and I was more than happy to let them dig their hole a little deeper. The silence at the table was suddenly broken by the sharp sound of my mother unzipping her designer handbag. Patricia reached inside, pulled out a brand-new, thick manila folder, and dropped it onto the polished mahogany tabletop. She pushed it forward with her perfectly manicured finger, letting it slide directly across the wood until it struck the edge of my dinner plate. "What is this?" I asked, my voice flat, making no move to touch the folder. "It's a formal notice to vacate," Patricia said, taking an elegant sip of her wine. "You have exactly 48 hours to clear all of your personal belongings out of the downtown apartment. Leave the keys on the kitchen counter when you go." I stared at the folder, then looked up at my mother. The downtown apartment was technically held under family trust to satisfy my father's obsession with controlling real estate assets, but I was the one who had paid the down payment, and I was the one who had been transferring the mortgage payments into their account every single month for the past 5 years. "You're evicting me," I stated, letting the reality of the words hang in the air. Brittany shifted in her seat, placing her hands protectively over her stomach, a gesture she used constantly as a shield. "We need the space, Cassidy. Jamal and I talked about it, and it just makes financial sense. We live out in the suburbs, but with the baby coming, we need a hub in the city. A place close to Jamal's office so he can rest when he's working late on those massive corporate deals. You're just a single woman with nothing going on. You don't need a 3-bedroom apartment downtown." "It's a family asset," Richard added, pointing his heavy silver fork at me. "And right now the family needs it for actual priorities. Brittany is bringing the next generation into this world. Jamal is bringing in real wealth. You are simply taking up space." I let out a short, hollow laugh. The sheer level of audacity was staggering. "So you're telling me to move out of the apartment that I have been paying for every month for 5 years?" "It is under the family trust," Patricia snapped, her voice rising in defensive anger as her diamond bracelets clattered against the table. "Legally, it belongs to us. You've just been paying rent and now your lease is up." I looked at Brittany, whose smug smile was practically radiating off her face, and then at Jamal, who was swirling his wine with complete indifference. The anger I usually kept suppressed began to surface, but I kept my tone strictly measured, masking the absolute fury brewing inside my chest. "This is fascinating," I said, leaning forward slightly. "You want to throw me out of the home I paid for, to give it to a sister who has never worked a day in her life, and a brother-in-law whose business only exists because of my money." Jamal slammed his wine glass down onto the table, the deep red liquid splashing dangerously close to the rim. "Watch your mouth, Cassidy. I built my firm from the ground up. What have you done?" "Have you?" I countered, locking eyes with him. "Because I remember things quite differently from 3 years ago. I remember sitting right here in this dining room when you and my father cornered me, demanding I empty my personal savings account. It was $200,000, Jamal. That was the startup capital you needed to launch your lucrative company, because not a single legitimate bank in this state would approve your loan application. Before Jamal could find his voice to respond, Brittany leaned across her plate, screaming at the top of her lungs. How dare you bring that up? You owed us that money. I owed you. I raised an eyebrow, genuinely amazed by my sister's delusional sense of entitlement. Yes, Patricia shouted, her polite upper-class facade completely shattering to reveal the ugly narcissism beneath. You owed this family. You owed us because of the absolute public humiliation you put us through. We secured you a spot in the top medical program in the country. We bragged about you to everyone at the country club, and what did you do? You quit. You threw away a prestigious medical degree to become a computer geek. Richard's face turned a violent shade of purple, the veins in his neck bulging as he echoed my mother. You disgraced us, Cassidy. Funding your sister's $300,000 wedding in the Hamptons and providing Jamal with his business capital was the absolute least you could do to make up for the shame you caused this family. Allowing you to live in that apartment was a massive favor. I looked at the four of them, a perfect portrait of shared delusion. They had completely rewritten history to justify their financial manipulation. When I left medical school to pursue cybersecurity, it wasn't a failure. It was a pivot to where my actual talents lay. But in their eyes, anything without a traditional upper-class title was worthless. They had bullied, guilted, and manipulated me into using my early tech earnings to fund their extravagant lifestyles, convincing themselves it was a penalty for my disobedience. So let me map out this ridiculous logic, I summarized with clinical precision. I emptied my savings for your wedding, Brittany. I funded your company, Jamal, because you were a high-risk liability to actual banks. I paid the mortgage on that apartment for 5 years, and your reward for my financial support is to call me a disgrace and throw me onto the street to make room for a nursery. You are a disgrace, Patricia bellowed, her chest heaving with dramatic indignation. Look at you, 33, entirely alone, bitter, and working a dead-end job. Brittany and Jamal are the ones actually contributing to society. They are the ones who matter. This house, that apartment, everything belongs to the ones who are actually building a legacy for this family. Jamal scoffed, adjusting his velvet lapels with a look of pure disdain. Your little contribution back then was a drop in the bucket, Cass. I took your money as a favor to give you a chance to be part of something bigger than your boring code projects. But now, it's time for the adults to take over the real estate. You have 48 hours, Richard growled, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. I want you completely out of that apartment by Sunday night. If you're not gone, I will have security throw your things onto the pavement. The sheer hostility in the room was almost tangible. They were practically vibrating with malicious joy, thrilled to finally have the family outcast under their boots. They expected me to break down. They expected me to cry, to beg, and to promise I would try harder to earn their love. They wanted to see me drop to my knees and plead for a place in their lives, for a roof over my head. I looked at the eviction notice, and then at the faces of the people who shared my blood but had never truly been my family. The urge to scream the truth in their faces was incredibly strong. I wanted to pull out my phone, show them my bank balance, and watch their jaws drop as they realized they were evicting a woman with $500 million in liquid assets. But that would have been too easy. That would have given them a chance to pivot, to apologize, and to try to manipulate their way into my new wealth. No, they deserved a much colder reality. They deserved to experience the exact devastation they were trying to inflict on me. I took a deep breath, letting the silence stretch across the dining room until the discomfort became a physical pressure. I looked at each of them, watching the desperate hunger in their eyes. They wanted a reaction. They wanted to see me shatter into a million pieces on the Persian rug. Patricia was leaning forward slightly, her lips parted, waiting for the first tear to fall. Brittany was practically bouncing in her seat with anticipation. Are you deaf as well as useless? Richard suddenly roared, his voice exploding through the high-ceilinged room. He had lost the last fragile grip on his patience, and he slammed his heavy fist down onto the mahogany table. The violent impact rattled the fine china, sending a few drops of Jamal's expensive red wine splashing onto the spotless white tablecloth. I said you have exactly 48 hours, Richard snarled, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. You need to stop playing the victim. You are going to go back to that apartment, pack up your cheap clothes and clear out. You are a guest in the legacy I built, and your welcome has officially expired. Your legacy, I repeated softly, letting the word hang in the air. Yes, my legacy, he shot back venomously, his face darkening to an unhealthy shade of crimson. The legacy of this family. Brittany and Jamal are expanding that legacy while you sit around typing on a keyboard. You will leave that property spotless. If I find a single scratch on the walls or even a piece of trash left behind, I will personally have my security team drag you to the curb. I won't have my pregnant daughter moving into a filthy environment. Brittany nodded aggressively, crossing her arms over her chest. Honestly, Cassidy, you should be thanking us. We let you experience an upscale lifestyle in a luxury high-rise for years, but you're just not city material. You belong in some depressing suburban studio apartment, ordering takeout and coding all night where you won't bother anyone important. Make sure you hire professional cleaners before you hand over the keys. I absolutely refuse to have my baby breathing in whatever cheap perfume you use. The delusion was breathtaking. They had convinced themselves they were my saviors, entirely erasing the reality that my monthly wire transfers were the only reason the apartment still existed. Patricia let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, picking up her wine glass with an air of aristocratic boredom. It's for your own good, Cassidy. Maybe hitting rock bottom will finally force you to wake up and get a real career. Maybe you'll finally realize that ignoring your mother's advice has consequences. I told you years ago that leaving medical school ruined your life. Now look at you, evicted from your own family's property because you lack the capacity to contribute. I have contributed plenty, I said, my voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. Jamal let out a loud, mocking laugh that cut through the tension like a rusty knife. He leaned back in his chair, stretching his legs out, and adjusted the cuffs of his tacky velvet suit. He looked down his nose at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated condescension, the kind of look a billionaire might give a beggar on the street. You contribute, Jamal chuckled, shaking his head as if I had just told the funniest joke in the world. Oh, Cass, you really live in a fantasy world. Paying a few utility bills or buying groceries isn't a contribution. Real contribution is what I do. Real contribution is managing portfolios, moving millions across international markets and securing generational wealth for this family. You don't even know what real money looks like. He reached into the interior pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a thick silver money clip. It was stuffed with high-denomination bills, a blatant, tacky display of the wealth he loved to project. With a practiced flick of his wrist, he unclipped the money and peeled off a crisp, brand-new $100 bill. He held it up between two fingers, waving it slightly so it caught the light of the chandelier. Tell you what, Jamal said, his voice dripping with mock pity. Since it's Thanksgiving and I'm a generous man, I'm going to help you out. I know things are going to be tight for you now that your free ride is over. And I know how hard it must be for someone in your income bracket to secure movers on such short notice. With a casual flick of his wrist, Jamal tossed the $100 bill across the dining table. It fluttered through the air, sailing over the roasted turkey and the crystal glassware, landing squarely on my dinner plate, right on top of my untouched food. Use that to rent a U-Haul, Jamal grinned, while Brittany giggled beside him. Or maybe put a down payment on some cardboard boxes. Consider it an early Christmas present from the successful side of the family. You're welcome. Patricia smiled approvingly at her son-in-law. You are far too generous, Jamal. I hope you know how to show gratitude, Cassidy. After the attitude you've given us tonight, this is far more than you deserve. I sat completely still, looking down at the crisp bill resting on my plate. The symbolism of the moment was almost poetic. Here was a man who was secretly drowning in debt and facing an active investigation for financial fraud, throwing a $100 bill at a woman who had just deposited $500 million into a private offshore account. The irony was so intense that I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing out loud. They sat there like a pack of predators, waiting for me to break. They wanted me to grab the money in tears or scream and throw it back in his face. They wanted a spectacle. They wanted the satisfaction of watching the family scapegoat shatter under the weight of their collective cruelty. They were practically holding their breath, eyes locked onto my face, desperate for the emotional collapse they believed they were owed. But I wasn't the defenseless girl they had bullied into emptying her savings years ago, and I wasn't the fearful college dropout who believed their venomous words. I was something entirely different now, sitting quietly in their midst, holding the power to level their entire existence. I stared at the $100 bill on my plate, anchoring this exact moment in my mind, sealing their fates forever. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a single tear. I didn't raise my voice, and I certainly didn't beg. The room became so quiet that the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway sounded like a hammer striking an anvil. I took my linen napkin, carefully wiped the corners of my mouth, and cleared away any trace of the meal I had barely touched. Then, with a deliberate, unhurried motion, I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor, a sharp sound that made Brittany flinch and cover her stomach. I stood up, reaching my full height, and smoothed down the front of my trousers. I looked down at the $100 bill. It was a pathetic, wrinkled piece of paper that represented everything this family stood for: cheap drama and empty dominance. I made no move to pick it up. I left it right there to absorb the grease from the food. My mother narrowed her eyes, clearly unsettled by my silence. She opened her mouth to launch another insult, but my absolute stillness froze her. People who expect a screaming match never know how to handle total, freezing detachment. They had loaded their weapons, fired their best shots, and now they couldn't comprehend why I wasn't bleeding out on their dining room floor. I reached into the side pocket of my blazer. My fingers wrapped around a heavy metal keychain containing the electronic key fob and brass deadbolt keys to the downtown apartment, the exact property they claimed to be evicting me from, the exact property my automatic transfers had saved from foreclosure for the past half-decade. I pulled the keys out slowly. The metallic chime was the only sound in the suffocating room. I extended my arm, suspending the keys directly over the center of the mahogany table, right above a massive, expensive autumn floral arrangement my mother had undoubtedly bought on a maxed-out credit card. I opened my hand. The heavy keys plummeted, striking the polished wood with a sharp, echoing clatter that made Jamal blink in surprise. "There are your keys," I stated, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "I won't be needing those 48 hours. As of this exact second, the apartment is officially vacant. You can send your cleaning crew over whenever you like. Just make sure to tell them to scrub away your grand delusions while they're at it." Richard let out a loud scoff, trying to regain control of the room. "Fine," he barked, adjusting his collar viciously. "I'm glad you finally decided to stop throwing a tantrum and accept reality. Just don't come crawling back to us begging for money when you realize you can't afford a security deposit anywhere else." I ignored my father entirely. I looked past his flushed, angry face and locked my eyes directly onto Jamal. The self-proclaimed financial genius was still grinning, but the smile didn't reach his eyes anymore. A shadow of unease was creeping into his posture. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the back of my dinner chair. "I hope your financial deals are as lucrative as you say they are, Jamal," I said, making sure every syllable carried with crystal-clear precision, "because the property taxes are due next week." The grin vanished from his face, replaced by a brief, involuntary flash of panic. He knew, and I knew he knew, that his offshore accounts were entirely fabricated. He opened his mouth to counter, to throw another insult about my computer work, but I didn't give him the chance. I turned on my heel and walked away. "Oh, look at her," Brittany sneered loudly across the table, her voice chasing me down the hallway. The classic Cassidy dramatic exit. "She'll be crying to Mom for grocery money by tomorrow morning." "Let her go," Patricia chimed in, sounding immensely satisfied. "A breath of fresh air will do this family good." I didn't look back. I didn't pause at the door. I walked straight out of the dining room through the grand foyer and pushed through the heavy oak front door into the freezing November night. The bitter wind hit my face, but it felt incredibly clean. I walked down the sweeping driveway toward my car, a modest sedan I drove intentionally to avoid drawing attention to my success. Behind me, the muffled sound of their laughter drifted through the massive bay windows of the estate. They were raising their glasses to their victory. They were celebrating the eviction of the family failure. They truly believed they had won. I slid into the driver's seat, started the engine, and turned on the heater. As I backed out of the driveway and shifted into drive, a genuine smile finally broke across my face. I watched their crumbling, debt-ridden mansion shrink in my rearview mirror. They had absolutely no idea that the warning about the property taxes wasn't just a petty insult. It was the start of the countdown. I merged onto the highway, heading toward the city, leaving them behind in the prison of their grand illusions. My mind was already off their pathetic Thanksgiving dinner. My focus was entirely on tomorrow morning. While they woke up in a house they couldn't afford to heat, nursing hangovers from wine bought on credit, and celebrating the acquisition of a minor downtown apartment. I would be sitting in a sleek skyscraper in Manhattan. I would be holding a premium fountain pen, signing my name to a deed for an $87 million property. The cold night air howled against my windshield as I accelerated down the interstate. I didn't feel homeless. I didn't feel abandoned. I felt entirely powerful. They wanted me out of their house and they got their wish. But when midnight struck and my automated bank transfers officially ceased to exist, they were going to learn a brutal lesson about who was actually keeping a roof over their heads. My finger was hovering over the virtual launch button that would dismantle their finances entirely, and I couldn't wait to press it. The early morning sun pierced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 60th floor boardroom in Midtown Manhattan. The light reflected off the sleek glass conference table with a clarity that was almost blinding. The clock read exactly 9:00 a.m. on Friday morning. While my family was likely still asleep in Connecticut, nursing their wine hangovers and celebrating the acquisition of a minor downtown apartment, I was sitting across from three of the most powerful real estate attorneys on the East Coast. The contrast between my parents' decaying estate and this room was staggering. There were no fake antique vases here, no forced displays of heritage. The room smelled of rich espresso, fine polished leather, and absolute undeniable authority. My lead attorney, a sharp-eyed man named Donovan, slid a thick leather-bound folder across the glass table. He tapped the top page with an expensive silver pen. "The wire cleared 5 minutes ago, Cassidy," Donovan stated, his voice low, steady, and thoroughly professional. $87 million, paid entirely in cash. No financing involved, no strings attached. The funds have been successfully routed directly from your primary holding account to the seller's escrow. The island castle is officially yours. I picked up the silver pen. It felt heavy and substantial in my hand. I looked down at the deed. The island castle wasn't just a piece of real estate. It was a literal fortress situated on a private island off the northeast coast, complete with stone ramparts, a private helipad, and a state-of-the-art security grid. It was the ultimate isolated sanctuary, originally built by a reclusive industrialist, and now it belonged to me. With a smooth, continuous motion, I signed my name on the dotted line. Donovan verified the signature and nodded, passing the documents to his assistant for notarization. "I must admit," Donovan said, a brief smile breaking through his professional exterior, "executing a cash transaction of this magnitude is unusual, even for our firm. That acquisition by the tech conglomerate truly transformed your portfolio overnight." I set the pen down and leaned back into the ergonomic leather chair. The acquisition he was referring to was the culmination of my life's work. My family thought I was a low-level coder, typing away on a laptop in a dark room. They completely missed the fact that my independent cybersecurity firm had spent the last 6 years developing a quantum-resistant encryption algorithm. Just 2 days ago, a global defense group finalized the purchase of my software. The purchase price was $500 million. $500 million had landed in my accounts, while my mother was busy criticizing my wardrobe. My boring computer nerd job had actually altered the landscape of data security, but none of it mattered if the money drew the wrong kind of attention, especially from the parasites who shared my last name. "The anonymity protocols are fully active," I asked, turning my attention back to Donovan. "Watertight," Donovan replied, pulling a second, much thinner folder from his briefcase. "We've buried the purchase under a labyrinth of 3 separate offshore shell companies. As far as public records are concerned, the island castle was acquired by an unnamed international holding group. Even the seller has no idea who you are. We just need your signature on these non-disclosure agreements to bind the real estate agents and the escrow company." I took the pen again, quickly signing the NDAs. Absolute privacy was non-negotiable. I knew exactly how financial predators operated because I had grown up in a house full of them. If Richard or Jamal caught even a whisper that I was sitting on $500 million, they would launch a campaign of legal harassment, fake apologies, and emotional manipulation until they bled me dry. The eviction last night was the greatest gift they could have given me. By throwing me out, they severed the last psychological tie I had to their toxic ecosystem. I owed them absolutely no explanations, no favors, and no mercy. Donovan gathered the signed agreements, placing them securely inside his briefcase. "Congratulations, Cassidy. The keys to the island will be delivered to your hotel suite this afternoon. The estate staff and private helicopter crew are already on standby, awaiting your instructions. I looked out the massive windows, watching the tiny yellow taxicabs crawl like insects along the streets of Manhattan below. My mind drifted back to the eviction notice on my mother's dining table and the ridiculous $100 bill Jamal had thrown at my plate. This was the divergence point. My family was busy celebrating a fake victory built on unpaid bills and massive egos. They thought they had successfully shed their weakest link. They thought their social standing was secure, but they were entirely dependent on a financial pipeline, and I had just permanently cut it off. A harsh reality was about to hit them like a freight train. Without my automated bank transfers quietly subsidizing their lifestyle, their entire world was going to collapse. I didn't need to shout or argue to make my point. I just had to step aside and let gravity do the work. I stood up, buttoning my tailored blazer. I shook hands with my legal team, the physical weight of this new reality settling perfectly onto my shoulders. I had walked into this building a disowned daughter, a supposed failure thrown out onto the street. I was walking out an invisible billionaire, the owner of a fortified island, and the silent architect of my family's impending financial ruin. I walked toward the heavy glass doors of the boardroom, feeling an incredible surge of adrenaline. Let them enjoy their fake victory for the weekend. Let them post their smug photos and brag to their friends at the country club. They had no idea the countdown timer had already hit 0. 200 miles away, entirely oblivious to the massive shift in power that had just occurred in Manhattan, my sister was busy broadcasting her delusions to the world. Brittany stood in the grand foyer of my parents' Connecticut estate, holding her phone high to catch the best angle for her Instagram live. She was wearing a silk maternity robe that likely cost more than a standard mortgage payment, her hair perfectly styled in loose waves. Jamal stood right behind her, holding a chilled bottle of imported champagne and 2 crystal flutes. "Welcome to our Friday morning, everyone," Brittany cooed into the camera, blowing a kiss to the hundreds of followers tuning in. "Jamal and I are celebrating some massive family news. We are officially expanding our real estate portfolio." Jamal popped the champagne cork with an incredibly dramatic flourish. The golden liquid spilled over the edge, staining the expensive imported rug beneath their feet. He poured the wine, handing a glass to Brittany, who held it purely as a prop. "That's right," Jamal said, stepping into the frame and wrapping his free arm around Brittany. "We just reclaimed a prime piece of downtown real estate. When you're building a legacy for the next generation, you have to make cold, calculated business decisions. Sometimes that means trimming the fat and cutting out the dead weight." Brittany laughed, a sharp, piercing sound that echoed off the marble floor. "It's all about protecting your energy. We absolutely refuse to let a toxic, unmotivated tenant occupy a space that belongs to our growing family. Our new downtown hub is going to be completely gutted and remodeled. I'm thinking imported Italian marble for the nursery bathroom." They clinked their glasses together, playing the part of a highly successful power couple. The comments section on her phone screen exploded with likes and praise from social climbers blinded by the carefully manufactured illusion. They truly believed their own lies. They felt completely untouchable, entirely unaware that the downtown apartment they were bragging about was already slipping through their fingers. And the champagne they were wasting was bought on a credit card gasping for air under compounding interest. While Brittany and Jamal were performing for their digital audience, my mother was busy curating her own reality distortion field a few miles away at the Wellington Country Club. Patricia sat at a prime terrace table bathed in morning sunlight, surrounded by 3 of the most affluent and judgmental socialites in the state. She wore a spotless white tennis skirt, a cashmere sweater draped elegantly over her shoulders. She held a silver spoon, stirring a cup of Earl Grey tea with practiced grace as she held court. "It was truly the only logical choice," Patricia said smoothly, leaning in to share her fabricated gossip. "Richard and I had to draw a line. We gave Cassidy every single opportunity to succeed, but some people simply refused to elevate themselves." One of her friends, a woman dripping in diamonds, let out a gasp of manufactured sympathy. "It must be so exhausting for you, Patricia, to have one child who is so brilliant and another who simply refuses to launch. Oh, it's a tragedy." Patricia sighed dramatically, placing a hand over her heart. "But we had to evict her from the downtown property. Jamal is doing so phenomenally well at his firm, and with the new baby coming, he desperately needs a city space for his late-night executive meetings. We simply couldn't allow Cassidy to drag down our family brand anymore. We sent her on her way. I told her she needs to figure life out and stop relying on our connections. The women murmured in agreement, validating my mother's twisted narrative. Patricia drank in the attention, absorbing their admiration like a sponge. She snapped her fingers to call over a waiter. "Bring us a bottle of your finest vintage sparkling rosé," Patricia ordered, without even looking at the menu. "Put it on my account. We're celebrating new beginnings today." The waiter nodded and hurried away, completely unaware that Patricia's account was a ticking time bomb. She leaned back, crossing her legs elegantly, offering a warm smile to her friends. She felt like a queen presiding over a prosperous kingdom. She genuinely believed that throwing me out had not only secured her social standing, but had also insulated her from any scrutinizing eyes. She thought that by sweeping me under the rug, she had successfully hidden the rot that was consuming our family's foundation. Meanwhile, Richard was packing the edge of the country club's parking lot, far away from his wife's glossy brunch. His face was slick with cold sweat, and he was chewing nervously on an unlit cigar. He held his phone tightly against his ear, listening to the agonizing drone of an automated banking menu. He was trying to verify the available credit limit on his primary corporate card. His manufacturing firm had already missed 2 major supplier payments this week, and the vendors were threatening to halt all shipments. Richard wiped his brow with the back of his hand, waiting for the robotic voice to deliver the final numbers. When the automated system finally rattled off his available balance, Richard closed his eyes and let out a shaky sigh. Less than $5,000. Not even enough to cover payroll, let alone the mountain of massive material invoices sitting on his desk. But instead of facing reality, Richard shoved the phone back into his pocket and squared his shoulders. He forced a fake smile of absolute confidence onto his face and marched back toward the country club terrace to join his wife. They were all dancing on the deck of a sinking ship, completely mesmerized by the music the band was playing, ignoring the water rising around their ankles. Their arrogance was so blinding that they never stopped to ask themselves how their extravagant lifestyle had miraculously sustained itself for so long despite their repeated failures. They never questioned why the bank had never called to demand the mortgage on the downtown apartment. They never wondered why their utility bills always managed to stay current. They were completely intoxicated by their own delusions, broadcasting their fake victories to the world, while their actual financial safety net had just walked out the door. The contrast between their loud, expensive boasts and the empty reality of their bank accounts was pure poetry. They spent the entire morning celebrating my departure, completely blind to the fact that I was the only structural pillar holding their fake empire from turning into dust. Their champagne was poured, their lies were told, and their social media posts were live. Everything was perfectly aligned for the most devastating reality check of their lives. The leather seats of the sleek black Lincoln were buttery soft and immaculate, providing a silent, climate-controlled sanctuary that cut out the chaos of Manhattan traffic. I sat in the back, watching the towering skyscrapers reflect the late morning sun as my driver navigated toward a private marina on the East River. A luxury transport vessel was docked and waiting to ferry me to a coastal helipad, where my private helicopter was prepped for the final leg of the journey to the island castle. I leaned back against the headrest, savoring the absolute serenity of the soundproof cabin. The contrast between my current reality and my relatives' pathetic, loud boasts on social media couldn't have been more extreme. While they were busy screaming their fabricated wealth into the digital void, I was executing a total financial dismantling in absolute precision and silence. Reaching into my designer tote bag, I pulled out my encrypted smartphone. A quick biometric scan unlocked the screen, bypassing my newly established offshore portfolio and navigating straight to one of my oldest, most mundane checking accounts. The screen loaded, displaying a digital ledger I had maintained for over half a decade. This account was something my family knew absolutely nothing about, yet it was the very account that had been pumping air into their life support system for 5 years. I scrolled down to the recurring transfers section and pulled up the master list of automatic payments. Sitting at the very top of the screen was the biggest parasite of them all, a $15,000 wire transfer scheduled to execute on the 1st of every month, routed directly to Prime Lending Bank. The memo line read simply, Connecticut Estate. 5 years ago, long before Jamal showed up and before Brittany got married, Richard had called me in the middle of the night, sobbing uncontrollably in his mahogany study. His manufacturing company had taken a massive hit, and the bank had already initiated foreclosure proceedings on the family mansion. He begged me for help, promising it was just a temporary cash flow issue. I had just landed my first major cybersecurity contract, and against my own better judgment, I stepped in. I negotiated a strict loan modification with the lender and set up a blind trust to handle the monthly payments, allowing Richard to save face. He told Patricia and Brittany that a brilliant new business investment had saved the house. They never knew that the unmotivated, boring computer nerd was the only reason they weren't sleeping in a motel. Over time, Richard selectively forgot where the money was coming from. He began to believe his own lies, treating me with the same disdain as everyone else, confident I would never cut off the funds because he thought I cared too much about family loyalty. He mistook my silent financial backing for weakness. I stared at that active $15,000 recurring transfer. This payment was an invisible shield protecting them from the brutal reality of their own failures. Because the mortgage was under a special loan modification program, missing even a single scheduled payment would immediately void the agreement. The bank wouldn't send polite reminders. They would instantly demand a massive balloon payment of the entire outstanding principal, plus half a decade of accumulated late fees and penalties. My thumb hovered over the flashing red button on the screen. There was no hesitation, no lingering guilt. The moment they handed me an eviction notice and slammed a $100 bill into my face, they had made their choice. I tapped the screen. A confirmation window popped up, asking if I was absolutely certain I wanted to permanently delete this recurring wire transfer. I pressed confirm. The screen refreshed. The Connecticut estate payment vanished from the ledger. The digital umbilical cord was officially severed. It was done. A profound, intoxicating sense of relief washed over me. I exhaled a breath I felt like I'd been holding for 5 years. But I wasn't finished. If I was going to clean house, I was tearing it out by the roots. I continued scrolling down my list of automated payments and found the telecommunications plan. Years ago, Patricia had convinced me to upgrade my personal cell phone plan into a premium family package, claiming it was more convenient for bookkeeping if all the lines were combined. Over time, they added Brittany and later Jamal, upgrading to the latest smartphones every single year without ever offering to split the bill. I was paying nearly $900 a month, just so they could use high-speed data networks to post content about their delusional, luxurious lifestyles. I logged into the carrier's portal. I selected the Family Management tab and checked the boxes next to Patricia, Richard, Brittany, and Jamal's names. I didn't just pause their data. I selected the option to permanently disconnect and close the lines. The system warned me that this action was irreversible and that their numbers would be released back into the network pool. I clicked execute. At that exact second, miles away in country clubs and suburban mansions, 4 premium smartphones simultaneously lost all cellular service. Their Instagram lives would instantly go black. Their arrogant text messages would fail to send. They were completely cut off from the outside world. I kept going. Next on the chopping block was the shared insurance policy. It contained top-tier, full-coverage insurance for Richard's imported Mercedes and Brittany's luxury SUV. They drove cars they couldn't afford, protected by insurance they didn't pay for. I navigated to the policy management panel and deleted every single vehicle except for my own modest sedan. Immediately after, I logged into the health and dental insurance portal, stripping away the premium add-ons I had been funding to cover Patricia's expensive, non-essential dermatology appointments. Click by click, touch by touch, I dismantled the invisible infrastructure of their lives. I stripped away the mortgage, the communications, the vehicle protection, and the medical safety net. In less than 10 minutes, sitting in the silence of a smooth-riding luxury sedan, I had rendered them completely orphaned financially. The sedan drifted to a halt, stopping smoothly next to a private berth at the marina. The driver stepped out to open the door for me, and the crisp, salty air of the East River rushed to greet me. I stepped onto the pavement and slid on my designer sunglasses. I looked down at my phone one last time. My checking account now showed 0 pending outbound transfers. All the parasites had been successfully detached from the host. I slid the phone into my pocket, feeling as light as air. I walked toward the dock, where a sleek, polished transport vessel was waiting to carry me toward my new empire. The counterattack was officially launched. And the most beautiful part was, I didn't have to lift another finger. The automated collection systems of corporate America were about to descend upon my family like a pack of starving wolves. All I had to do now was sit back on my private island and watch the fallout unfold. As I rode the luxury speedboat, cutting through the cold Atlantic waves, sipping sparkling water and feeling the ocean breeze on my face, the first shockwave hit the Connecticut estate. The automated systems I had unleashed didn't care about holidays, social status, or family pride. They operated with cold, algorithmic precision. It was a Tuesday morning. Richard stood in the spacious foyer of the mansion, drinking a bitter cup of black coffee, nursemaiding a massive headache. His manufacturing company was already bleeding out, and he was mentally rehearsing which payments he could delay for another week. A sharp, aggressive pounding on the heavy oak front door interrupted his self-pity. Richard opened the door, expecting a courier delivering more of Patricia's expensive online shopping hauls. Instead, he faced a uniformed messenger holding a thick, rigid cardboard envelope. The messenger wasn't smiling. He simply held out a clipboard and a pen, demanding a legally binding signature for a piece of certified mail. Richard sighed in irritation and scribbled his name, annoyed that a service worker would disturb him before 10 in the morning. He shut the door, walked into his mahogany study, and tore open the envelope. Inside was a dense stack of legal documents bearing the unmistakable embossed logo of Prime Lending Bank. Adjusting his reading glasses, Richard's eyes scanned the bold capital letters at the top of the first page. Notice of default and immediate acceleration of debt. His irritation instantly dissolved into a cold, paralyzing dread. Gripping the edge of his massive desk, his eyes raced through the merciless paragraphs of legal jargon. The letter outlined the catastrophic reality in brutal detail. The special loan modification agreement that had protected this estate for half a decade had been officially terminated due to the revocation of the automated third-party payment authorization. Because the safety net was gone, the bank was no longer offering any grace periods. Richard's heart hammered against his ribs as he reached the bold financial summary at the bottom of the page. The bank was demanding the immediate lump sum payment of the outstanding principal, plus 5 years of deferred late fees and unpaid property taxes. The total amount due to halt active foreclosure proceedings was $120,000. Payment had to be finalized before the end of the business week. A cold sweat broke out on Richard's forehead. $120,000. He didn't even have 20,000, let alone 120. His personal accounts were nearly depleted, and his business accounts were heavily overdrawn. Pure, unadulterated panic gripped his throat. With trembling fingers, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his premium smartphone. He needed to call his private wealth manager at the bank immediately. He needed to scream at them, threaten to move his non-existent assets, and demand they correct this clerical error. He dialed the number and pressed the phone to his ear, but instead of a ringing tone, he was met with dead silence. He pulled the phone away and looked at the screen. The signal bars in the top right corner had completely vanished, replaced by a glaring warning, "No service." Richard tapped the screen frantically, toggling airplane mode on and off, but the network connection remained dead. His premium unlimited data plan simply did not exist anymore. Before he could even process this technical glitch, the heavy door to his study was flung open. Patricia burst into the room, her face pale, clutching a printed email in her hand. She was wearing a silk morning gown, but she looked completely unraveled. "Richard, what on earth is wrong with our accounts?" Patricia screamed, her voice echoing off the panelled walls. "My phone is completely dead. I had to connect to the house Wi-Fi just to check my email, and I just received a cancellation notice from our auto insurance company. They cancelled the insurance on my Mercedes and Brittany's SUV. They said the primary policyholder revoked authorization." Richard stared at his wife, the pieces of the puzzle locking together with terrifying clarity. The revoked bank transfer, the disconnected phones, the cancelled insurance policies. It was a synchronized, total collapse of infrastructure. A sickening realization washed over him. The invisible benefactor who had saved the house 5 years ago, the mysterious account that had quietly paid their bills while they bragged about their wealth, was never some magical business investment. It was Cassidy, the daughter he had just forcibly evicted from his home, the woman he had called a worthless freeloader. He refused to say her name out loud. His fragile ego simply couldn't handle the massive humiliation of admitting that the daughter he discarded was the only pillar keeping him afloat. He forced the thought down, replacing shame with desperate, frantic action. "I'll handle it," Richard barked, though his voice lacked its usual commanding authority. "It's just a banking error, a temporary glitch." He sat down at his computer monitor, booted up the desktop interface, and opened a Wi-Fi calling application. He didn't have time to coddle Patricia or worry about the cars. He had exactly 3 days to raise $120,000 in liquid cash, or the bank would hang heavy locks on those massive oak doors and throw them all onto the street. There was only one person in his inner circle who claimed to command that kind of capital. The man who had waved a $100 bill at the Thanksgiving dinner table, boasting about high-yield dividends. With trembling fingers, Richard typed in Jamal's phone number. He waited as the digital ringing tone chimed through the computer speakers. After 4 rings, Jamal finally answered. Jamal's voice sounded tight, completely lacking the smooth, arrogant rhythm he usually projected. "Jamal, it's Richard," he said, forcing his tone to sound like he was addressing a minor administrative nuisance rather than begging desperately for salvation. "There's been a small administrative issue with the estate's primary mortgage account. The bank is being incredibly difficult over a routing error, and they are demanding a lump sum payment to settle the ledger." A heavy pause hung over the line. Richard could hear Jamal's shallow, rapid breathing. "How large of a lump sum?" Jamal asked cautiously. $120,000, Richard stated. "I need you to move a small fraction of those massive profits you were talking about at dinner. Liquidate whichever offshore portfolio you need to, but I need a cashier's check or a direct wire to Prime Lending Bank by Friday morning. We'll credit it as an early investment into your future inheritance." An agonizing silence followed. Richard gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles turning white. He was pushing all his chips to Jamal's side of the table, completely unaware that he was begging a drowning man for a life raft. He had no idea that the man on the other end of the line was currently staring at his own frozen bank accounts, cold sweat soaking through his designer shirt as the steel walls of a federal investigation closed in on him. Jamal swallowed hard, tasting the bitter bile at the back of his throat. The silence on the phone had stretched for a dangerous second. He forced a low, booming laugh from his chest, pouring every ounce of fake, arrogant confidence into the receiver. $120,000, Jamal asked, his voice dripping with feigned amusement. "That's it. You sound like someone died, Richard." Jamal leaned back in his plush leather chair, even though his knees were shaking violently beneath his heavy glass desk. "Look, Richard, you know I dropped that cash to protect family assets in a heartbeat, but I just locked my primary capital into a massive 5-year offshore bond in the Caymans yesterday afternoon. It's completely illiquid right now. Liquidating early today would trigger massive penalties. Let me make a few quiet calls and see if I can move some secondary assets around. Just hang tight." Richard thanked him profusely, the desperation practically leaking through the phone speakers. Jamal hung up the call and immediately slammed his smartphone onto the desk as if it were white-hot. The practiced smile instantly melted from his face, replaced by a pure, unadulterated mask of absolute terror. Heavy beads of sweat erupted across his forehead, tracing down his temples and staining the crisp collar of his custom leather shirt. The central AC in his spacious corner office was pumping cold air, but Jamal felt like he was suffocating inside a locked oven. He ripped open the top drawer of his desk and pulled out his designer leather wallet. He grabbed his prestigious black metal credit card, the exact one he used to slam onto the tables of 5-star steakhouses to show off for gullible clients. Opening his banking portal on his sleek desktop monitor, he entered his login credentials with clammy, slipping fingers. A glaring red banner dominated the monitor screen. "Account frozen. Please contact your institution immediately for further INSTRUCTIONS." Jamal swore loudly under his breath. He grabbed his platinum business card, his hands shaking so violently he dropped it twice onto the glass desk. He typed the digits into a secure payment portal, desperately trying to wire a $10,000 retainer to his criminal defense attorney. Declined. He tried a third credit card, a private line of credit he kept hidden from Brittany. Declined. Jamal buried his face in his hands, pulling tightly at his meticulously faded hair. The charade was officially dead. There were no high-yield dividends. There was no offshore portfolio. The entire boutique brokerage firm he bragged about at every family gathering was nothing more than a Ponzi scheme built on predatory management fees and illegally leveraged client funds. He opened the bottom drawer of his heavy filing cabinet and pulled out a terrifyingly thick stack of legal documents bound by tight rubber bands. Sitting right on top was an undeniable official subpoena from the Securities and Exchange Commission. The feds had been quietly investigating his firm for 8 grueling months. Just 48 hours ago, they successfully froze his domestic bank accounts. He wasn't a financial prodigy. He was a desperate thief who had misappropriated nearly $3 million simply to maintain the illusion of extreme wealth. The velvet suits, the leased luxury sports cars, and Brittany's lavish lifestyle at the country club were all funded with stolen money. He was entirely broke. His net worth was deeply negative, and federal prosecutors were currently preparing an indictment that carried a minimum sentence of 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Jamal stared out his office window at the bustling city traffic below, a sharp panic blinding his vision. He had married Brittany specifically under the assumption that her family possessed deep, unencumbered generational wealth. He had planned to use Richard's manufacturing company as a legitimate corporate front to quietly launder some of the missing funds before federal agents noticed they were gone. But Richard was just as broke as he was. The entire family was a pathetic parade of frauds, propping each other up with empty boasts and maxed-out credit cards. They were all drowning, grabbing onto each other, praying for a rescue that didn't exist. A horrible realization hit Jamal like a physical blow to the chest. The only person in their entire orbit who possessed actual, legitimate liquid wealth was Cassidy, the quiet, low-profile sister he had mocked mercilessly, the woman whose face he had arrogantly slammed a $100 bill into less than 24 hours ago. Cassidy was the one paying the mortgage. Cassidy was the single structural beam holding up their roof, and they had just proudly kicked her out onto the street. Jamal felt a violent wave of nausea hit him. He grabbed a small, polished trash can from beneath his desk and emptied his stomach completely. He wiped his mouth with the back of a trembling hand, his breathing heavy. He couldn't tell Brittany. She was busy taking maternity photos and bragging about their fake wealth to her online followers. If she found out the money was gone, she would turn on him in an instant. Patricia and Richard would throw him straight to the federal wolves to save their own crumbling reputations. They would loudly claim to be victims of his deception, completely ignoring their own financial ruin. Jamal unclasped the massive gold watch from his wrist. It was a heavy, ostentatious piece he used to project dominance in boardrooms. He weighed it in his hand, calculating how much a high-end pawnshop would give him. He needed cash to survive the weekend. He needed a miracle. He needed a massive, pure, untraceable injection of cash to pay off his most aggressive and dangerous clients before they went to the authorities. And he needed a massive retainer for a lawyer who could keep him out of a federal cell. He stood up, packing his office like a trapped animal. He needed a billionaire. He needed someone with such a massive amount of disposable capital that they wouldn't look too closely at the fraudulent numbers he was prepared to show in a desperate pitch. While Jamal paced his office trying to manifest a billionaire savior out of thin air, his mother-in-law was completely oblivious to her impending social execution. Patricia sat on the sun-drenched terrace of the Wellington Country Club, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. Empty bottles of vintage sparkling rosé and the remnants of lobster salad sat between her and her 3 wealthy friends. She let out a high-pitched, practiced laugh, having just finished a story about her impeccable taste in interior design. The women smiled back, but their eyes were cold and calculating, measuring Patricia's worth by the lunch she was about to pay for. Patricia caught the eye of the head waiter and gave a dismissive wave. "The bill, please, we're finished." The waiter arrived within seconds, placing the black leather folder on the table. Patricia didn't even glance at the total. She reached straight into her designer handbag, pulled out a heavy metal credit card tied directly to Richard's corporate account, and placed it on the silver tray. "Run it," she commanded, turning back to discuss a charity gala with her friends. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Patricia tapped her manicured nails against the glass tabletop, annoyed by the delay. Finally, the waiter returned, but he was accompanied by the club's general manager. Both men looked deeply uncomfortable. "Mrs. Anderson," the manager said, dropping his voice to maintain discretion, "I am terribly sorry, but your card has been declined." The conversation at the table ceased instantly. The 3 socialites leaned forward slightly, their predatory instincts activated by the scent of financial blood. Declined, Patricia sneered, snatching the card back. That's absurd, the machine must be broken. This is a premium corporate account, run it again. We did run it twice, ma'am, the manager replied softly. The system is refusing authorization entirely. Do you have another form of payment? Patricia felt a hot flush of embarrassment creep up her neck. Her friends were watching her in silence. Fumbling through her wallet, she pulled out a personal platinum card and threw it onto the tray. Run that one, she snapped, and I will be filing a complaint with the board about this embarrassing technical glitch. The manager walked away. Patricia offered a stiff, frozen smile to her friends, muttering something about oversensitive bank security measures. But when the manager returned 2 minutes later, his face was stern. I'm sorry, ma'am, but that card was also declined. Furthermore, I have been instructed to inform you that your country club membership dues are currently 90 days past due. We cannot extend any in-house charging privileges to you. One of the women at the table let out a soft, mocking gasp. Patricia felt the blood drain from her face. Shaking, she grabbed her smartphone, desperate to call Richard and scream at him to fix this nightmare. She tapped his contact name, but the call failed instantly. She looked at the top right corner of her screen. No service. She was completely cornered. No money, no phone connection, no escape. I must have left my primary card in my other bag, Patricia stammered, standing up as her dignity deserted her. I'll have to go home and retrieve it. Go ahead, Patricia, one of her friends said, her voice dripping with vicious, fake pity. Don't worry about lunch. I'll take care of it. It sounds like you're going through a very difficult time lately. Patricia practically fled the terrace, her face burning with the ultimate high society humiliation. She had been stripped bare, exposed as a fraud. 30 miles away, Brittany was experiencing her own public disaster. She stood at the counter of an exclusive, upscale baby boutique downtown. The counter was piled high with a mountain of imported Italian crib linens, cashmere blankets, and designer diaper bags. The total came to nearly $8,000. Brittany tapped her phone against the payment terminal, using a digital wallet tied to Jamal's account. The terminal let out a sharp, loud buzz. DECLINED. Brittany rolled her eyes at the cashier. Your machine is glitching, try it again. She swiped her phone a second time. Another loud buzz echoed through the quiet, high-end shop. Other wealthy mothers browsing the racks turned to watch. I'm sorry, miss, the cashier said politely. The bank rejected the transaction. Do you have a physical card? Brittany huffed in annoyance, pulling Jamal's secondary credit card from her wallet and inserting the chip. DECLINED. She tried her personal card. DECLINED. She tried a third card. DECLINED. Brittany's heart began to race. She grabbed her phone to call Jamal and demand he transfer funds immediately, but the screen displayed the exact same jarring error Patricia was seeing. No service. Ma'am, the cashier said, her polite tone fading into irritation, if you cannot provide a valid form of payment, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. You're holding up the line. Brittany looked around. 3 other women were staring at her, whispering among themselves. The golden child, the woman who had spent the entire morning broadcasting her fake wealth to thousands of followers, was standing in a baby boutique, completely broke, without even a working phone. Tears blurring her vision, she grabbed her empty designer bag and ran out of the store, leaving the mountain of expensive baby clothes behind. Less than an hour later, the heavy oak doors of the Connecticut mansion were slammed open. Patricia burst into the foyer, her makeup smeared across her face. Brittany followed right behind her, sobbing hysterically. Richard stood in the center of the hallway, clutching the official foreclosure notice from the bank. He looked like he had aged 20 years since this morning. Jamal entered right behind Brittany. His tie was loosened, and his velvet suit looked wrinkled and pathetic. Having run out of gas and with all his cards useless, he had been forced to pawn his gold watch just to afford the cab ride back to the suburbs. What on earth is happening? Patricia screamed, throwing her useless designer bag against the wall. My cards were declined. The club manager humiliated me. My phone is completely cut off from the network. Richard, fix this right now. My cards are all dead too, Brittany wailed, pointing an accusing finger at Jamal. You promised me unlimited funds. You said your firm was making millions. I looked like a beggar in front of everyone. Shut up, Jamal roared, his fake charm entirely gone, replaced by the desperate fury of a cornered criminal. You think I care about your baby clothes? Federal agents are investigating my company. The accounts are frozen. We have nothing. Brittany froze, the color draining from her face. You lied to me. Richard crumpled the foreclosure letter in his fist and threw it violently against the marble floor. We are all finished, he bellowed, silencing the room. The bank is demanding $120,000 by Friday. The modification agreement is void. Why? Patricia cried, clutching her hair. We've been making the payments every month. No, Richard said, his voice dropping to a hollow, ghostly whisper. We never paid a single dime. Cassidy paid it. Cassidy paid for everything. The mortgage, the phones, the auto insurance. She was the one keeping us alive. And last night, while we were busy mocking her and kicking her out onto the street, she cut the wire. The truth exploded in the foyer like a physical detonation. The screaming stopped. The complaining ceased. A suffocating, terrifying silence fell over the four of them as they stared at the crumpled bank notice on the floor. They hadn't evicted a useless freeloader. They had proudly executed their only hostage negotiator, and now the collectors were closing in. The suffocating silence inside the foyer stretched on for what felt like hours, broken only by the quiet sound of Patricia sobbing into her hands. Over the next 48 hours, that silence evolved into a frantic, clawing desperation. The reality of their financial execution arrived with brutal efficiency. By Wednesday morning, Richard sat in his study wrapped in a heavy winter coat, as the utility company had officially disconnected the mansion's gas lines. He stared at a computer screen that displayed nothing but red numbers. His manufacturing company was officially, completely dead. Primary suppliers had officially frozen all material shipments and filed notices of default. His payroll account bounced, triggering a massive walkout on the factory floor. The business empire upon which he had built his entire arrogant persona had vanished into thin air, reduced to a mountain of bad debt. The rest of the house felt like a mausoleum dedicated to fake wealth. Patricia spent her days hiding behind drawn curtains, terrified to show her face in town. The country club had officially revoked her membership and posted her delinquent account on their internal bulletin board. Brittany paced the empty, unheated nursery, her maternity leave turning into a prison sentence as she realized she had married a broke criminal. The designer baby clothes she was forced to abandon at the boutique were a stinging reminder of her pathetic new reality. She complained constantly about the cold, but no one was listening to her anymore. Nobody was sweating more than Jamal. He locked himself in the guest bedroom, frantically tapping away on a cheap burner phone, the last thing he managed to buy with the remaining cash from pawning his watch. The walls of the federal investigation against him were tightening fast. His defense attorney was demanding a massive retainer that Jamal simply didn't have. If he couldn't secure a massive, untraceable injection of capital within a week, he would be spending the next 15 years of his life in a federal penitentiary. He paced the room, biting his nails, terrified of every car that drove past the estate, expecting federal agents arriving to handcuff him. Jamal tapped into the darkest, most desperate corners of his financial network. He messaged former fraternity brothers, disgraced brokers, and shady hedge fund managers. He begged for leads on ghost investors, venture capitalists looking to dump cash, anyone with deep pockets and a lack of regulatory scrutiny. Then a ping on an encrypted messaging app caught his eye. A former colleague, a man who specialized in high-level offshore real estate transfers, sent him a frantic inside tip. A massive, entirely anonymous cash transaction had just caused an earthquake in Manhattan's elite broker networks. Someone had just purchased the Island Castle, a private island fortress off the northeast coast, legendary for its exorbitant price and ironclad security. The purchase price was $87 million, paid entirely in liquid cash. The rumor mill was working overtime. The buyer was presumed to be an eccentric, reclusive tech billionaire who had just exited a massive defense contract and was looking to diversify a fresh $500 million fortune. Jamal stared at the burner phone screen, his heart pounding like a drum. A tech billionaire sitting on $500 million in fresh capital, hiding away on a private island. This wasn't just a lead. This was a godsend. If a billionaire could drop $87 million in cash on a castle without blinking, they wouldn't blink at tossing $10 million at a struggling manufacturing company and a boutique brokerage, especially if the pitch was wrapped in a high-yield distressed asset turnaround package. Jamal burst out of the guest room, sprinted down the hallway, and slammed into Richard's study without knocking. Richard was sitting with his head in his hands, staring blankly at the foreclosure notice. Jamal slammed both hands onto the desk, his eyes wide and manic, completely abandoning his usual smooth, collected facade. "We have a lifeline," Jamal panted. "I just got an inside tip. There is a ghost investor out there, a tech billionaire who just cashed out of a defense contract and bought the island castle for $87 million in pure cash. They are looking to deploy capital quickly to stay out of the traditional banking sectors." Richard looked up, his bloodshot eyes narrowing in skepticism. "An anonymous billionaire? Why on earth would they meet with us? Our credit is ruined. My company is insolvent. We don't even have gas in this house." "Because they are an eccentric tech nerd," Jamal said, packing the room with manic energy. "They don't understand traditional manufacturing, and they don't understand boutique finance. We sell them a story. We tell them your company is just experiencing a temporary supply chain bottleneck, but holds massive infrastructure value. We tell them my firm can leverage their new cash in high-yield secondary markets. We ask for a $10 million emergency bailout in exchange for 60% equity. We just need to get into the room. If we can get face-to-face with this isolated tech geek, we can charm the checkbook right out of their hands." It was a pathetic, delusional plan, built entirely on the assumption that a billionaire would be stupid enough to hand over millions without doing an ounce of due diligence. But desperate people don't see red flags. They only see life rafts. Richard stood up, a faint spark of hope reigniting the arrogance in his chest. He smoothed down the lapels of his wrinkled shirt, desperately trying to summon the aura of the powerful executive he used to be. "Find the brokers handling that island deal," Richard ordered, his voice a mixture of fear and revived superiority. "Bribe them, beg them, do whatever it takes to secure us a pitch meeting on that island. We are going to put on our absolute best suits. We are going to fly out there, and we are going to save our legacy. This family does not lose. We just need to align our narrative, Ben." Jamal nodded frantically, already dialing his burner phone to track down the estate manager's contact info. They were absolutely convinced that their smooth talking and fabricated confidence would save them from ruin. They had no idea that the pitch meeting they were actively begging for was an invitation directly into the slaughterhouse. While Richard and Jamal were busy plotting their delusional route to the imaginary tech billionaire, Patricia was fighting her own pathetic battle with reality in the freezing living room. The Connecticut mansion felt like a massive, beautifully decorated icebox. With no electricity and no gas, the ambient temperature had plummeted, forcing Patricia to wrap herself in double layers of cashmere blankets just to keep her teeth from chattering. She huddled on the expensive designer sofa, staring at the blank television screen, listening to the muffled, frantic shouting of the men down the hall. They were banking on a miracle. Patricia, however, was focused on immediate survival. Her bridge club friends had completely frozen her out, ignoring her calls and messages. The country club had officially cancelled her membership. She had exactly $14 left in her designer wallet, and the pantry was running dangerously low. She needed a quick, localized injection of cash just to maintain the absolute bare minimum of her daily routine, and her pride wouldn't allow her to beg her wealthy acquaintances. She opened her laptop, connecting to the weak, unstable mobile hotspot Jamal had set up using a prepaid burner phone. The battery icon glowed an ominous red, warning her that she was below 20%. She opened her email client, her stiff, freezing fingers hovering above the keyboard. There was only one person she knew who was so desperate for family validation that they would hand over cash. The very person they had viciously thrown out into the winter cold just days ago. Patricia convinced herself that Cassidy was currently suffering immensely. In Patricia's twisted mind, a woman without a prestigious family backing was nothing. She imagined her eldest daughter sitting on the edge of a stained mattress in some cheap, run-down roadside motel, crying into a pillow, completely heartbroken over losing her childhood home. Patricia began to type, carefully drafting a message dripping with weaponized maternal guilt and fake benevolence. "My dearest Cassidy," the email began, "I know things ended on a very unpleasant note at Thanksgiving, but a mother's love truly knows no boundaries. Your father and I are deeply worried about you out there on your own. I can only imagine how difficult it must be for you staying in some dreadful motel, probably regretting your dramatic and unnecessary exit. We want you to know that we are willing to forgive your emotional outburst." Patricia paused, rubbing her freezing hands together before continuing her fabrication. "In fact, as a show of good faith, we want to help you rebuild your relationship with this family. Your father's company is currently working on a massive, highly confidential expansion project, and due to some frozen assets, we are experiencing a very brief, temporary hitch in cash flow. If you could wire a small, short-term loan of $10,000 to my personal account, we would consider allowing you to return home. Look at this as a gesture of goodwill, proving that you are ready to be a contributing member of this family again. I look forward to your prompt response. Love, Mom. She clicked send, a smug, satisfied smile struggling to form across her shivering lips. She genuinely believed that Cassidy would read this and weep with gratitude. She thought her daughter would instantly transfer whatever pathetic savings she had left just to buy her way back into the warm circle of the family. Closing her laptop to save the dying battery, Patricia was entirely convinced she had just solved her immediate crisis with a masterclass in psychological manipulation. 200 miles away, the roaring Atlantic Ocean slammed violently against the jagged stone cliffs of a private island. Cassidy stood on the spacious, upper-level balcony of the island castle. The morning air was crisp, clean, and incredibly refreshing. She wore a floor-length silk robe over tailored loungewear, holding a steaming mug of a custom, premium roast coffee that her private estate chef had brewed for her just minutes ago. The entire estate operated with the silent, invisible efficiency of extreme, pure wealth. Below her, a landscaping team was manicuring the sweeping gardens that extended toward a private dock. To her left, a sleek, twin-engine helicopter sat on a reinforced concrete pad, its rotors gleaming in the morning light, ready to lift off at her absolute whim. She took a slow sip of her coffee, letting the rich flavors coat her tongue as she gazed out at the endless horizon. Sitting on the heavy stone balustrade, her encrypted smartphone let out a soft chime. Cassidy picked up the device. The biometric scanner instantly verified her identity. The screen lit up, displaying a forwarded message from her old personal email address. She opened it and read Patricia's words. A soft, genuinely amused chuckle escaped Cassidy's chest, quickly swallowed by the heavy ocean wind. The sheer, skyscraper-high audacity of the email was breathtaking. The irony was so thick it could be touched. Patricia was sitting in a freezing, dark, foreclosed mansion, begging for $10,000, and offering the privilege of returning to a house that Cassidy already legally owned as a reward. A dreadful motel, Cassidy said to herself, looking up from the screen to scan the impenetrable stone battlements and luxurious suites of her massive fortress. Her mother was attempting to establish dominance with a $10,000 ransom. Just yesterday, Cassidy had tipped her private helicopter pilot half that amount just for flying through light turbulence to pick up imported truffles from the mainland. The delusion was terminal. The disease infecting her family was past the point of a cure. It required complete eradication. Cassidy didn't feel an ounce of anger. You don't get angry at an ant trying to lift a boulder. You just watch it crush itself. With a flick of her thumb, she dismissively tapped the trash bin icon. The pathetic, manipulative email vanished into the digital void, permanently deleted without a single word of a response. The heavy glass doors leading to the balcony slid open with a soft, mechanical hiss. Her private head of security, a tall, imposing, well-dressed professional named Jackson, stepped onto the stone terrace. He held a secure tablet in his left hand, his posture rigid and disciplined. "Ma'am," Jackson said, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of the crashing waves. "We just received an urgent, maximum priority communication from the elite broker network, handling the blind inquiries for the estate." Cassidy turned away from the ocean, her silk robe billowing slightly in the wind. She leaned back against the stone railing, crossing her arms. "What is the status, Jackson?" "Exactly as you anticipated," he replied, handing her the tablet. "A boutique financial brokerage and a regional manufacturing CEO are desperately requesting an emergency audience with the new owner. They claim to possess a highly lucrative distressed asset turnaround pitch that requires immediate capital deployment. They are practically begging for a face-to-face meeting." Cassidy looked down at the tablet. In the broker's digital report, the names Richard and Jamal were highlighted. Driven entirely by their blind greed and desperation, they had marched themselves directly into the crosshairs. A cold, razor-sharp smile spread across Cassidy's face. The board was set. The pieces were moving exactly as she intended. "They bit," Cassidy said, handing the tablet back to her security chief. "Inform the brokers that the owner is willing to accept the pitch meeting. Tell them to wear their absolute best suits. I want them to fly as high as possible before I cut the engines." Jackson gave a crisp, military nod, spun on his heel, and left to relay the authorization to the broker on the mainland. I stepped back into the master suite. The heavy glass doors slid shut behind me, instantly cutting off the roar of the Atlantic. The time for passive observation was officially over. It was time to set the stage for their day of reckoning. I strode through the mansion's arched stone corridors straight toward my private quarters to change. 10 minutes later, I emerged wearing sharply tailored, slate-grey trousers and a crisp white shirt. Using the integrated smart intercom system, I summoned my estate manager, Gideon. He met me right outside the main boardroom doors, holding a secure digital tablet. "Gideon," I said, my voice echoing faintly against the polished marble walls, "we are hosting 4 guests tomorrow afternoon. I want their transit arrangements to be flawless. Send the twin-engine luxury helicopter to the mainland helipad. Stock the cabin with the most expensive vintage champagne from our cellar, and set up a full spread of imported caviar." Gideon nodded, his fingers flying across the tablet screen. "Understood, ma'am, and regarding their arrival on the island." "The full VIP treatment," I instructed, keeping a brisk pace. "Have the staff line up at the entrance to greet them. I want them to feel like absolute royalty from the exact second their feet leave the helipad. Build their egos as high as they can go, but make no compromises on security. Jackson and his team will confiscate all mobile devices, smartwatches, and electronics before they take a single step inside the castle. Tell them it's standard protocol for a high-security tech billionaire. They are far too desperate for money to refuse or complain." I dismissed Gideon and walked into the Apex boardroom. The room was a marvel of modern architecture. A massive glass cube cantilevered directly over the cliff's edge, suspended hundreds of feet above the crashing waves. A sprawling black marble conference table dominated the center of the room, facing a floor-to-ceiling smart glass wall that doubled as an interactive projection screen. I walked to the head of the table and plugged a military-grade encrypted flash drive into the main console, cracking my knuckles. As a cybersecurity architect, compiling data isn't just my profession, it's my art form. And today, my canvas was the complete financial collapse of my biological family. The smart glass wall flickered to life, bathing the dim room in a cold, blue digital glow. I split the massive screen into 2 distinct sectors. On the left, I prepared a complete, unedited financial autopsy of Richard Manufacturing. On the right, I opened the digital ledger that would serve as the final resting place for Jamal's boutique brokerage. I started with Jamal. Using my specialized decryption tools, I effortlessly bypassed the pathetic, low-level firewalls protecting his so-called offshore portfolio. Data cascaded down the screen like a waterfall in real time. I pulled up the official SEC subpoenas, highlighting the exact dates and the specific federal regulations he had violated. But I didn't stop there. I dug deeper, tracing the precise routing numbers of the client funds he had misappropriated. I created a dynamic, color-coded flowchart showing exactly how Jamal funneled stolen investment capital directly into his personal checking account. I linked the stolen deposits side by side with his credit card statements. The screen displayed his $15,000 charges at custom velvet suit tailors, his exorbitant luxury car lease payments, and Brittany's endless designer handbags, all paid for with stolen retirement pensions. The final figure flashed at the bottom of the screen in bold red numbers. Stolen funds, $3.2 million. Remaining balance, $0. Next, I turned my attention to Richard. His corporate executive bravado was even easier to dismantle. I pulled up the internal accounting ledgers of his manufacturing plant. I pinpointed the exact week he began cooking the books to cover up a massive hemorrhage of cash. I projected the fraudulent tax returns he had filed over the last 3 years, highlighting his wildly inflated revenue projections. I exposed the fake shell companies he created to hide piling debt, along with falsified balance sheets claiming ownership of heavy machinery that had actually been repossessed months ago. For the final blow, I brought up the payroll records from just 48 hours ago that had bounced, proving his issue wasn't a temporary supply chain bottleneck, but absolute irreversible insolvency. I even prepared a special edition for Patricia and Brittany. On a secondary slide, I pulled up the frozen status of Patricia's country club membership, alongside a time-stamped log of Brittany's declined credit cards at a luxury baby boutique. I wanted every single one of them to see their individual failures illuminated in stark contrast to my success. I I wanted them to realize that while they were desperately clutching at fake status symbols, I was quietly holding the keys to the entire kingdom. I stepped back, crossing my arms as my eyes swept across this massive wall of financial misdeeds. The data was airtight. It was an undeniable masterpiece of liability. No loopholes, no excuses, and absolutely no alternative narrative they could spin to lie their way out of it. When they sat in this room and looked at this screen, they would see a harsh, high-definition mirror reflecting the ugly, pathetic truth they had spent their lives running from. I typed the final command into the console, linking the entire presentation to a tiny, concealed remote hidden beneath the lip of the marble table. Then I dimmed the boardroom lights completely, leaving only the natural light pouring in from the ocean view windows. I walked over to the high-backed black leather executive chair at the head of the table. I spun it around so it faced the glass wall, making whoever sat in it completely invisible from the boardroom entrance. Everything was perfectly aligned. The trap was set, heavily baited with the promise of unimaginable wealth, and wired to the explosive truth of their own arrogance. My hand brushed against the cool, smooth surface of the marble table, and a deep sense of absolute peace washed over me. I had spent a lifetime being gaslit, demeaned, and treated like a speck of dust. Tomorrow I wouldn't raise my voice. I wouldn't shed a single tear. I would simply turn my chair, press a button, and let the raw, unforgiving data act as judge, jury, and executioner. 200 miles away, the freezing temperature inside the Connecticut estate did nothing to cool Jamal's frantic packing. He stared intently at the cracked screen of his prepaid burner phone, his thumb hovering over the refresh button of his email client. He had been refreshing his inbox for 14 hours straight. The edges of his fingernails were bitten raw. The battery icon dropped to 9%. Then a crisp metallic chime broke the dead silence of the guest room. An email from the elite Manhattan brokerage appeared on the screen. The subject line read, "Island Castle pitch meeting confirmed." Jamal opened the email, his eyes scanning wildly over the brief, cold text. The anonymous owner of the island castle had agreed to see them for 30 minutes tomorrow afternoon. Transportation would be provided by a private helicopter from the mainland helipad. Jamal let out a sound that was half sob, half triumphant roar. He had done it. He had actually hooked a whale. In his delusional mind, this meeting was a mere formality. He was a master salesman, and this eccentric tech nerd was nothing more than an open vault waiting to be plundered. He kicked the guest room door open and sprinted down the hallway. He slid into the spacious living room, where Richard, Patricia, and Brittany were huddled around an unlit fireplace, wearing heavy winter coats indoors like refugees in a luxury museum. "Get up," Jamal shouted, clapping his hands with explosive energy. "Get up right now. We are back in the game." Richard looked up from a stack of final eviction notices, his eyes sunken and exhausted. "What are you screaming about, Jamal? We're freezing to death in our own home." "We're not freezing, Richard. We're just at an intermission," Jamal boasted, puffing out his chest as his arrogant posture returned in full force. "I just locked down the meeting. The ghost billionaire on the island accepted the pitch. We fly out tomorrow afternoon on their private chopper." The shift in the room was instantaneous and utterly sickening. Patricia threw off her cashmere blanket, her posture snapping back into her usual aristocratic stiffness. Brittany gasped, clutching her pregnant stomach, her eyes widening with sudden greed. Richard stood up, tossing the eviction notices onto the freezing floor. "You locked down the meeting?" Richard asked, a manic smile spreading across his flushed face. "I secured the legacy," Jamal corrected aggressively, straightening the collar of his rumpled shirt. "I told you I'm a closer. This tech guy dropped 87 million on a castle, which means he has at least 20 million in liquid cash just sitting around to inject into your plant and my brokerage. We walk in, dazzle him with our combined business acumen, and walk out with a blank check." Patricia began packing the room, her mind instantly snapping back to superficial appearances. "If we are meeting a billionaire on a private island, we can't walk in looking like this. We need to project absolute dominance. We need to look like we don't need his money at all. Brittany, you need a new maternity dress. It has to be custom. Richard, your current suits are completely out of season." "Mom, my cards are all maxed out," Brittany complained, her voice shifting back to her usual spoiled tone. "The baby boutique humiliated me yesterday. What are we supposed to buy custom clothes with?" Richard rubbed his temples, the reality of their $0 balance briefly interrupting his delusion. "She's right, Patricia. We don't have any credit lines left. The bank accounts are completely frozen." Jamal smirked, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small, tightly rolled wad of cash. It was exactly $2,000, the last remnant of cash he had obtained the day before after pawning his heavy gold watch. It was supposed to be emergency escape money in case federal agents came knocking, but his arrogance had completely overridden his basic survival instincts. "We're not buying," Jamal announced, slamming the cash onto the cold glass coffee table. "We're renting. There's a high-end boutique rental service downtown that caters to clients who need to look like multi-millionaire executives for a weekend. $2,000 is more than enough to get the four of us top-tier designer outfits for 24 hours. "You want us to wear rented clothes?" Patricia gasped, clutching her chest as if physically assaulted, like common teenagers going to a prom. "It's an investment, Patricia," Richard snapped, his eyes locked onto the crumpled cash. "Jamal is right, we have to look the part. We put on the armor, secure this bailout funding, and by tomorrow night, you can buy that entire boutique if you want." The next 4 hours were a masterclass in pathetic vanity. They piled into Richard's imported Mercedes, which had barely a quarter tank of gas left, and drove downtown. They walked into the rental boutique acting like they owned the building. Patricia demanded the staff bring her their most exclusive Chanel pieces. Brittany threw a tantrum until they found a silk maternity gown that perfectly accentuated her pregnant belly. Richard selected a charcoal Tom Ford suit, while Jamal opted for a sleek, aggressively tailored navy Armani. They handed over the entire $2,000, emptying their collective net worth down to the literal penny. They drove back to the freezing Connecticut estate, carrying garment bags that were worth more than all the money currently in their bank accounts. That night they didn't pack bags, they rehearsed. In the cold, dark living room, illuminated only by the flashlight on Jamal's burner phone, they practiced their lies. Jamal paced back and forth, delivering his fraudulent pitch about high-yield secondary markets and explosive offshore returns. Richard practiced his firm handshake and authoritative tone, reciting fake metrics about his dead manufacturing company. Brittany practiced looking like a picture-perfect, wealthy mother-to-be. They built each other up into a state of absolute frenzy. They convinced themselves that this anonymous billionaire was just a naive nerd who would be easily charmed by their upper-class pedigree and smooth business jargon. They completely forgot about the eviction notices sitting on the dining room table. They completely forgot about the frozen bank accounts and the massive fraud investigations. They were entirely focused on the golden parachute waiting for them on the island. They fell asleep shivering in the dark under heavy winter coats, but their minds were filled with illusions of private jets and endless credit lines. They had bet their last dime on a theatrical performance, entirely unaware that they had just purchased front-row tickets to their own exposure. The morning light broke through the frosted windows of the Connecticut estate, waking them from their freezing sleep. They didn't have the luxury of hot showers or a warm breakfast. Instead, they quickly stripped off their heavy coats and stepped into their rented designer armor. The house was a miserable icebox, an undeniable monument to their failure, yet they strutted through the dark hallways as if preparing for a royal coronation. Richard aggressively adjusted his charcoal suit, checking his reflection in the hallway mirror to ensure the perfect tailoring hid his recent weight loss and the deep fatigue under his eyes. Patricia smoothed the wrinkles of her Chanel suit, pretending the lack of running water was a minor inconvenience rather than a glaring sign of absolute ruin. Brittany squeezed into her custom silk gown, complaining loudly about the bitter cold biting at her ankles, while Jamal meticulously inspected his reflection, making sure his navy Armani looked sharp enough to dazzle a reclusive tech tycoon. They piled into the Mercedes, holding their breath as Richard turned the key. The engine sputtered, finally roaring to life with the gas gauge resting terrifyingly below the red line. Driving on literal fumes, they made it to the mainland private helipad in absolute silence, terrified that a wrong turn would leave them stranded on the highway in rented clothes they could never afford to replace. When they pulled up to the private aviation terminal, they gasped collectively. Parked on the pristine tarmac was a massive, twin-engine black helicopter. It looked like a military-grade transport wrapped in pure, unadulterated luxury. A pilot in a sharp, spotless uniform stood by the open cabin door, waiting with professional stoicism. He greeted them with a respectful nod, addressing Richard as Sir, and treating the entire group with the exact degree of calculated deference I had specified. Jamal puffed out his chest, strutting across the tarmac, as if he had chartered the aircraft with his own bottomless funds. He reached out to help Brittany up the steps, leaning in to whisper that he planned to buy this exact model once their offshore funds cleared. The interior of the helicopter was breathtaking. Plush beige leather seats faced each other in the spacious cabin, which was lined with polished walnut paneling. Noise-cancelling headphones rested on the armrests, promising a smooth, quiet ride across the Atlantic. Richard sank into his seat, letting out a long, relieved sigh. This, he believed, was the environment he was fundamentally entitled to. Patricia crossed her legs elegantly, running a manicured hand over the soft leather. Her previous humiliation at the country club was completely forgotten in the face of this new, sky-high display of wealth. They buckled their seatbelts, their egos inflating like hot air balloons despite their empty stomachs and bank accounts, drained to absolute zero. The helicopter rotors began to spin, creating a powerful hum that vibrated through the floorboards. As they lifted off, tilting smoothly toward the open ocean, Jamal noticed a built-in refrigerated console between the seats. He slid the panel open, revealing a silver ice bucket packed with crushed ice. Sitting perfectly in the center was a bottle of vintage champagne, flanked by 4 crystal flutes and a small tin of imported caviar. The sheer luxury of the gesture swept over them, erasing any lingering doubts. Jamal lifted the bottle, his eyes widening as he read the gold-embossed label. He knew enough about luxury brands to recognize that a single pour of this vintage cost more than his monthly car lease. He popped the cork with a definitive sound that was barely muffled by the hum of the blades, pouring 4 glasses and distributing them to the family with a triumphant grin. They clinked their glasses in midair, toasting to their imminent salvation. They sipped $1,000 champagne on empty stomachs, completely oblivious to the fact that the woman they despised had personally selected this bottle specifically to mock their financial starvation. Patricia took an elegant sip, the crisp, expensive liquid warming her chest and fueling her arrogance. She turned her head to look out the reinforced glass window. Below them, the dark, churning waters of the Atlantic stretched to the horizon. The view was spectacular, the perfect backdrop for her revived sense of superiority. She let out a sharp, amused laugh, shaking her head as she looked at Richard and Jamal. "Imagine if Cassidy could see us right now," Patricia said through her headset intercom, her voice dripping with malicious satisfaction. "She's probably eating instant noodles in some basement while we are flying to a castle." "She probably had to pawn her laptop just to pay for her motel room," Brittany scoffed loudly, placing a protective hand over her pregnant belly. "Honestly, it's poetic justice." "She refused to support this family, and now she gets to watch us ascend to the absolute top of society without her," Richard chuckled, scooping a generous portion of caviar with a pearl spoon. "Good riddance, Patricia. Let her suffer. We have a billionaire to impress. We don't have time to worry about a bitter dropout." Jamal swirled the champagne in his glass, leaning forward. "Exactly, Richard. We walk into this boardroom, establish absolute dominance and dictate the terms. This tech guy dropped $87 million on a rock in the ocean. By the time I'm done with the pitch deck, he'll be begging us to manage his liquid capital. I'll have a $10 million funding injection before the appetizers are even served." Patricia nodded enthusiastically, taking another sip. "We just need to remind him of our social pedigree. New money always craves validation from old money. We give him a taste of our class, and he'll hand over his checkbook just to feel like he belongs in our exclusive circle." The helicopter tilted slightly, cutting through a low, dense layer of coastal clouds. As the grey mist cleared, a massive, imposing structure materialized on the horizon. The island castle loomed over the dark ocean like a fortress out of a cinematic epic. Jagged stone cliffs rose vertically from the crashing waves, topped by sprawling battlements and ultra-modern glass architecture. It was a flawless marriage of ancient strength and billionaire-tier security. Brittany gasped, her hands pressed against the cool window. "It's massive," she whispered, her greed practically fogging up the glass. "Look at the size of that private dock. They have a super yacht parked down there." Richard sat up straighter, aggressively adjusting his silk tie. "Does everyone remember the plan? We do not look amazed. We act like this is just another Tuesday. We belong here." Jamal downed the rest of his champagne, placing the empty crystal flute back into the holder. He cracked his knuckles and rolled his shoulders, loosening the tension in his rented Armani suit. "I'm ready to close this deal. Let's go drain this nerd's bank account." The helicopter touched down smoothly, its massive rotors whipping the coastal wind into a frenzy. The landing gear met the reinforced concrete pad of the island castle with a satisfying heavy thud. The engines began to spool down, shifting from a deafening roar to a low, mechanical whine. Jamal was the first to unbuckle, stepping out of the cabin with his chest puffed out, entirely ready to conquer the island. Richard followed closely behind, offering a hand to Patricia, while Brittany stepped down carefully in her rented gown, desperate to maintain the illusion of high society grace. The freezing ocean spray hit their faces, instantly ruining Patricia's styled hair, but she didn't dare complain. Waiting for them at the edge of the pad, standing in absolute stillness, was Jackson. My head of security looked like a special operations operator poured into a flawless custom black suit. His posture was rigid, his expression entirely unreadable. Flanking him on either side were two other security personnel who projected the same sharp, intimidating aura. "Welcome to the island castle," Jackson said, his voice carrying effortlessly over the sound of the waves crashing against the jagged cliffs below. "The owner is expecting you. However, before we cross the perimeter, I must enforce the estate's security protocol." Jackson stepped forward, presenting a velvet-lined security tray. "All mobile devices, smartwatches, and electronic recording equipment must be surrendered immediately. The owner operates under strict, military-grade non-disclosure agreements. No external signals are permitted within the inner chambers." Jamal bristled, his fake authority instantly challenged by the imposing guard. "I am the managing director of a financial firm," Jamal said, puffing out his chest to match Jackson's height. "I need my devices on me for urgent market alerts. You can tell your boss I'll keep it on silent." Jackson didn't blink. He didn't move the tray. He simply stared at Jamal with cold, dead eyes. "The protocol is non-negotiable, sir. Surrender the electronics, or the pilot will be instructed to return you to the mainland immediately." Patricia practically shoved Jamal aside, her desperation overriding his fragile male ego. "Don't be ridiculous, Jamal," she hissed, pulling her deactivated smartphone from her designer bag and dropping it onto the velvet tray. "It's completely understandable. We are dealing with extreme wealth. Just hand it over." Richard nodded frantically, pulling his own devices from his pockets and tossing them onto the tray. "We respect the owner's privacy," Richard assured Jackson with a tight, overly eager smile. "Absolute discretion is how we conduct all of our business." Defeated, Jamal unstrapped his smartwatch and tossed his burner phone onto the pile. Brittany followed suit, pouting slightly as her only connection to her fake social media audience was confiscated. Seeing that their devices were secured, Jackson gave a sharp nod to the secondary guards, who stepped aside and pushed open the massive, reinforced steel gates leading into the castle courtyard. "Follow me," Jackson commanded, turning on his heel. "Do not wander from the designated path." The walk through the estate was a masterclass in psychological intimidation. The family was led through vast, immaculately manicured botanical gardens that defied the harsh coastal elements. They walked past a series of biometric security checkpoints, each blinking with a soft, pulsing blue light. The walls of the outer corridors were constructed from imported dark stone, adorned with genuine, priceless modernist artwork that made the fake antique vases in their Connecticut estate look like cheap garage sale junk. Brittany was breathing heavily, the rented silk gown clinging uncomfortably to her pregnant frame, but she forced herself to keep up without complaining. Her eyes darted wildly around the opulent surroundings, silently calculating the kind of net worth required to maintain this level of isolated luxury. Patricia walked beside Richard, her manicured fingers gripping his arm so tightly her knuckles turned white. She was shivering from a volatile mix of intense intimidation and ravenous greed. This was exactly the lifestyle she felt she was born to live, and she was already imagining herself sipping tea on the private dock. Richard wiped a fresh bead of cold sweat from his upper lip. His rented charcoal suit felt suffocating in the climate-controlled halls. He kept adjusting his necktie, running through the fraudulent revenue numbers of his dead manufacturing company in his head. He needed to sound completely unflappable. He needed to sound like a man who wasn't desperate for a $10 million handout just to stay afloat. Jackson led them down one final, sweeping corridor lined with floor-to-ceiling ballistic glass, offering an unobstructed, terrifyingly high panorama of the Atlantic. At the end of the hall stood two massive, imposing doors of black oak. "The boardroom," Jackson announced, stopping dead in front of the entrance. He pressed his thumb against a digital scanner seamlessly integrated into the wood. The mechanical locks disengaged with a heavy, satisfying click. "The owner will see you now." Jackson pushed the double doors open, gesturing for the four of them to enter. They stepped into the room, and the breath caught collectively in their throats. The boardroom was an architectural wonder, a massive glass cube suspended directly over the cliff's edge. It felt as though they were floating completely in midair above the churning ocean. The natural light was intense, reflecting brilliantly off a sprawling, 30-foot-long black marble conference table that occupied the center of the room. There were no assistants, no junior executives. The room was chillingly silent, save for the muffled, distant crash of the waves hundreds of feet below. At the furthest end of the long marble table, backed by the massive glass wall facing the sea, sat a high-backed black leather executive chair. The chair was turned completely away from the entrance, presenting only its dark leather back to the arriving guests. The person sitting inside was entirely hidden from view. The family froze at the opposite end of the table. Their rented shoes sank into the plush, dark carpeting. They didn't dare sit without being invited. The tension in the room was so thick it felt almost physical. Jamal leaned slightly toward Richard, keeping his voice to a barely audible whisper. "Let me do the talking first. I'll hook him with the offshore yields, then you cut in with the infrastructure play. Just project power." Richard nodded rigidly, his throat bone dry. Patricia stood tall, plastering her most flawless aristocratic smile onto her face, ready to charm the eccentric billionaire the second he turned around. Brittany smoothed the front of her dress, practicing a look of serene, wealthy motherhood. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a unified front of absolute pretenders. Their bank accounts were empty, their credit was destroyed, and their reputations were hanging by a frayed thread. But at this exact moment, they still believed they were the smartest people in the room. They held their breath, their heartbeats sinking as they waited for the mysterious billionaire to turn around so they could pitch the lies that would save their lives. The heavy leather chair began to rotate. The mechanical hum of its swivel base was the only sound inside the massive glass boardroom. It turned slowly, deliberately, maximizing the agonizing suspense that completely paralyzed my family. Richard stood a little taller. Patricia locked her most radiant, practiced smile into place. Jamal took a deep breath, preparing to launch into his fraudulent pitch. And then the chair locked into place, facing them directly. I didn't smile. I didn't offer a greeting. I simply sat there, leaning back against the dark leather, my hands resting calmly on the armrests. I was wearing a custom, razor-sharp slate-grey power suit that fit absolutely flawlessly. My hair was styled into a sleek, uncompromising look, and my posture radiated an untouchable, absolute authority that could not be faked. The reaction was instantaneous and utterly spectacular. The eager, desperate smiles on their faces melted away like wax near a flame. Patricia let out a strangled, high-pitched gasp, her manicured hand flying to her mouth. Her designer handbag slipped from her grip, hitting the plush carpet with a dull thud. Richard physically recoiled, stumping backward a step, his eyes wide and unblinking as if he had just seen a ghost materialize in the center of the room. Brittany froze entirely, her mouth hanging open in a silent, comical circle of pure shock. For 10 agonizing seconds, nobody breathed. The cognitive dissonance in the room was so thick it was suffocating. Their brains simply could not process the visual information they were receiving. The woman sitting in the billionaire's chair was supposed to be a pathetic, homeless dropout crying in a cheap motel room. She wasn't supposed to be sitting at the apex of a hypersecure island fortress, looking like a corporate executioner. Jamal was the first to break the silence. His fragile male ego simply refused to accept the reality unfolding in front of him. His brain aggressively rejected the truth, desperately constructing an alternative script that would allow him to maintain his fake sense of superiority. He let out a loud, hollow bark of a laugh. It was a harsh, nervous sound that echoed awkwardly against the glass walls. He shook his head, running a hand over his freshly faded haircut and pointing a finger at me. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me," Jamal scoffed, his voice dripping with aggressive disbelief. "Cassidy, seriously, you work here?" Richard blinked rapidly, latching onto Jamal's delusion like a drowning man grabbing a lifesaver. He let out a shaky breath, adjusting his silk tie with aggressive force. "Of course," Richard muttered, his voice trembling slightly. "Of course she works here. She does computer stuff. She's probably the IT staff or something." Patricia recovered her aristocratic posture instantly, her shock twisting into an intense, self-righteous rage. She glared at me, her eyes flashing with pure malice. "Cassidy, what on earth do you think you are doing sitting in that chair?" Patricia hissed, her voice cutting sharply across the long marble table. "Get up this instant. Do you have any idea how important this meeting is?" We are here to see the owner of this island. If your employer walks in and sees you playing house in his boardroom, you will be fired on the spot." Brittany scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes and crossing her arms over her rented maternity dress. "Honestly, this is so typical of you," Brittany whined. "We fly all this way for a multi-million-dollar business pitch and my sister is a glorified receptionist. Don't ruin our moment, Cassidy. Go get your boss right now. Tell him Richard and Jamal are ready for the presentation and get us some sparkling water while we wait. My feet are killing me." Jamal stepped forward confidently, resting his knuckles against the edge of the black marble table. He flashed me his signature predatory smile, the exact same smile he had worn when he slammed that $100 bill onto my dinner plate. "All right, Cass," Jamal said, using the patronizing nickname I absolutely detested. "Joke over. You got to sit in the big chair. Now be a good assistant and go fetch the billionaire. We have very serious, high-level financial matters to discuss, and we don't have time to play games with the help." I didn't move, I didn't blink, I didn't offer a single word of response to their pathetic, desperate insults. Their arrogance had blinded them to the obvious facts. They were standing inside a fortress that required military-grade clearance just to enter, yet they actually believed a low-level assistant could just hijack the main boardroom. I let them drown in their own stupidity for a moment longer, savoring the absolute silence I maintained in the face of their demands. Slowly, I reached into the interior pocket of my custom suit jacket. My movements were calm, deliberate, and entirely devoid of urgency. I pulled out a thick document printed on premium, watermarked legal parchment. It was the master deed to the island castle. I placed the document flat onto the polished black marble. I rested the tips of my fingers against the edge of the heavy parchment. With a single, smooth, powerful shove, I sent the document sliding directly down the center of the massive table. The heavy paper made a sharp, hissing sound as it glided across the polished stone. It traveled the entire 30-foot length of the table, decelerating perfectly right in front of Jamal and Richard before coming to a gentle stop. "Take a good look," I thought to myself, maintaining my absolute icy silence. "Look at the reality you refuse to accept." Jamal frowned, irritated by my refusal to speak. He looked down at the document resting at his fingertips. Richard leaned in closer, squinting to read the elegant, bold typography printed at the very top of the page. The room became impossibly quiet. Only the sound of the ocean waves crashing against the cliffs outside filled the silence. Jamal reached out and picked up the paper. His eyes scanned the first few lines. I watched his face intently, waiting for the exact millisecond the illusion shattered. "It happened in an instant." The arrogant smirk vanished from his lips, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of absolute, unadulterated horror. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him a sickly, ashen grey. His hands began to shake so violently that the heavy parchment rattled in his grip. "What does it say?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking with a sudden, uncontrollable panic. "Jamal, what is it?" Jamal couldn't speak. His Adam's apple bobbed silently as his eyes locked onto the bold, capitalized letters near the bottom of the page. He was staring directly at the purchase price, $87 million, paid in full. And directly beneath that staggering, impossible number was the undisputed, legally binding signature of the sole property owner. "Cassidy." Jamal dropped the document back onto the table as if the paper had caught fire. He stumbled backward, his legs giving out slightly, forcing him to lean against Richard to steady himself. He looked up at me, sitting motionless at the head of the table, bathed in the natural light pouring from the ocean windows. The terrifying, overwhelming truth had finally pierced through his dense skull. There was no eccentric tech nerd. There was no ghost investor coming to save them. The billionaire they had flown out to beg for a lifeline was the exact same woman they had heartlessly thrown out of her own home. I didn't give them a single second to process the crushing weight of their own stupidity. Before Richard could fabricate a pathetic excuse, and before Patricia could attempt to recant her insults, I reached beneath the lip of the black marble table and pressed a hidden button. The motorized blackout shades descended seamlessly over the floor-to-ceiling windows, plunging the room into a dramatic, intense dimness. A heartbeat later, the massive smart glass wall behind me flared to life, casting a stark, icy blue light across their terrified faces. "Welcome to your pitch meeting," I said, my voice echoing with a chilling, clinical detachment. "You came here seeking a $10 million emergency injection to save a highly profitable distressed asset turnaround project. You claim to be titans of industry, so let's do what any responsible billionaire investor does before deploying capital. Let's conduct a thorough due diligence check on your actual net worth. I pressed a button on the tiny remote in my hand. The left half of the massive glass screen illuminated with a highly detailed color-coded flowchart. At the very top, glowing in high definition, was a scan of an official federal document. Jamal let out a choking gasp, his knees finally failing him completely. He collapsed heavily into one of the luxury leather boardroom chairs, his rented Armani suit instantly looking like a cheap costume. He stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. His hands gripped the armrests, his knuckles turning completely white. "This is a subpoena from the Securities and Exchange Commission," I narrated, slowly packing back and forth in front of the glowing wall. "It details an active 8-month covert investigation into your boutique brokerage firm. But we don't need to wait for the federal prosecutors to build their case, Jamal, because I've already done the math for them." I clicked the remote again. The screen zoomed in on a series of offshore bank routing histories. I highlighted the exact routing numbers. "Here we see the retirement pensions you actively misappropriated from your most vulnerable clients. And directly next to it, we see exactly where that money went. It didn't go into high-yield Cayman Island bonds. It went directly to the custom tailor who made your velvet suits. It went to the leasing company for your luxury sports cars. And it went to the high-end maternity boutiques Brittany frequented to play the part of a prominent socialite." Brittany let out a sharp, horrified shriek, scrambling away from Jamal as if he was suddenly contagious. "You stole the money," she screamed, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "You told me we were rich. You told me my baby was inheriting a business empire. You're completely broke." I looked directly at my brother-in-law. The screen flashed a massive, undeniable 0 at the bottom of the ledger. "You misappropriated over $3 million to maintain a fake persona, and now you have absolutely nothing to show for it except a guaranteed minimum sentence in a federal facility. Your pitch is rejected, Jamal." I didn't pause to let the devastation settle. Turning my attention to the right side of the screen, I pressed the remote. A dizzying array of spreadsheets, tax filings, and unpaid invoices filled the glass wall. Richard stumbled backward, clutching his chest as if having a medical emergency. His face lost every ounce of color, blending in perfectly with the light grey carpet beneath his feet. "Now for the patriarch of the family," I continued, my voice remaining as precise as a surgeon's scalpel. "Richard, you came here to pitch me a narrative about a temporary supply chain bottleneck. You told me your manufacturing plant just needed a bridge loan to unlock massive infrastructure value." I pressed the remote, bringing up a massive red graph that mapped out a catastrophic downward spiral. "This is your internal accounting ledger from the past 36 months, I explained, pointing to the free-falling red line. "You have been cooking the books to hide a massive, uncontrollable hemorrhage of cash. You filed fraudulent tax returns claiming inflated revenues to secure secondary loans you had no intention of paying back. Here is the balance sheet claiming ownership of heavy machinery that was actually repossessed by creditors 6 months ago. And right here, highlighted in bold red, are the bounced payroll checks from just 2 days ago that caused your entire factory floor to walk out on strike." Richard was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps, his hands shaking violently as he stared at the irrefutable evidence of his utter failure. Patricia grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his rented charcoal suit. "Tell her it's a lie, Richard," she begged, her aristocratic mask completely shattering into a million jagged pieces. "Tell her the business is fine. Tell her we have assets." "He can't tell you that, Mom," I interjected, bringing up one final document on the screen. "Because he knows I have a copy of the exact default notice delivered to the Connecticut estate yesterday morning. The same estate where your power and utilities are currently shut off. The corporation is completely insolvent. You aren't experiencing a temporary cash flow hiccup. You are thoroughly, irreversibly bankrupt." Patricia let out a pathetic wail, her knees buckling slightly as the full weight of her poverty crashed down on her. She looked at the massive blue screen as if it were an oncoming train. Her social standing, her country club membership, her entire identity had just evaporated into digital dust. I shut off the projector. The room plunged into darkness for a brief second before the blackout shades automatically retracted, flooding the boardroom once again with the blinding, natural light reflecting off the ocean. The bright light felt harsh and unforgiving, exposing every bead of sweat on Jamal's forehead and every deep, terrified line on Richard's face. I walked back to the head of the table, leaning against my leather chair. I looked at the four of them. They looked like entirely different people from the arrogant, mocking family that had boarded the helicopter just an hour ago. Their rented clothes looked ridiculous. Their postures had collapsed. Their towering egos had just been surgically removed and crushed right in front of their eyes. The financial autopsy was complete. It had taken me exactly 4 minutes to completely destroy the illusion they had spent decades building. I hadn't raised my voice once. I hadn't used a single derogatory insult. I had simply let the data speak, and the data proved they were nothing more than a collection of parasitic frauds. The sheer weight of the truth crushed the last remnants of Brittany's fragile composure. The golden child, the woman who had built her entire identity on a foundation of superiority, suddenly broke down. A ragged, hyperventilating wail pierced the silence of the boardroom. She clutched at the fabric of her rented silk maternity dress, digging her manicured nails into her thighs as she collapsed completely onto the plush carpet. "You ruined my life," Brittany screamed, pointing a trembling finger at Jamal, who still sat paralyzed and lifeless in his chair. "You promised me an empire. You told me my child would grow up in luxury. You're going to prison, and I'm going to be a single mother on the street." She buried her face in her hands, sobbing with a frantic, ugly intensity. There was no social media filter here, no carefully curated angles. This was the raw, unedited collapse of a woman who had just realized she was completely destitute and legally bound to a federal criminal. Patricia stared at her weeping daughter, then looked over at Richard, who had gone completely catatonic. His mouth hung open, his eyes staring blankly at the financial grave that had been projected on the glass wall. The aristocratic illusion Patricia had spent decades cultivating was dead. The country club, the luxury cars, the lavish luncheons, all of it was gone. The only thing standing between her and absolute poverty now was the very woman she had maliciously ridiculed and thrown out of her house just days prior. Patricia's knees gave out. The woman who wore her pearls like a crown and treated service workers like peasants fell directly to her knees on the boardroom floor. Dragging her rented Chanel skirt across the carpet, she crawled forward, closing the distance between us. Tears streamed down her face, leaving heavy tracks of black mascara across her cheeks. "Cassidy, my beautiful daughter," Patricia wept, her voice a ragged, desperate rasp as she reached out with trembling hands, hovering just inches away from my polished leather shoes. "Please, you have to understand us. We were just stressed. We were under so much pressure trying to save your father's company. We didn't mean any of the things we said." I looked down at her, my face an absolute mask of uncompromising stone. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. I looked at the woman who had called me a parasite and allowed her son-in-law to throw cash at my feet, and I felt nothing but a cold, analytical detachment. "We are blood, Cassidy," Patricia begged, her voice rising into a hysterical shriek. "We are family. You can't just leave us with nothing. You have $500 million. You could save your father's company right now. You could pay off Jamal's debts and keep him out of prison. Please, I am your mother. We gave you everything." "Family doesn't lock each other out in the freezing cold on Thanksgiving, Patricia," I stated, my voice echoing sharply through the vast room. "Family doesn't bleed their own child dry to fund a fake lifestyle of luxury. You don't get to play the family card only when your bank account hits zero." I stepped away from her grasping hands, walking deliberately toward a hidden compartment seamlessly built into the edge of the black marble conference table. I pressed a concealed panel, and a shallow drawer slid open. Reaching inside, I pulled out a brand-new heavy manila folder. It was an exact, meticulously chosen replica of the folder Patricia had slammed onto my dinner plate. I walked back to the head of the table. Richard had finally snapped out of his catatonic state, his bloodshot eyes tracking my movements. Jamal slowly raised his head, his face slick with cold sweat. Patricia pushed herself up from the floor, leaning heavily against the table for support, her breath catching in her throat. I placed the manila folder flat on the polished stone surface. With a single, smooth, powerful shove, I sent it sliding directly down the center of the massive table. It glided across the marble, bumping gently against Richard's hands. "What is this?" Richard whispered, his voice completely broken, sounding like a terrified child rather than a corporate titan. "I bought the note from the bank," I announced, my words cutting through the room like a scalpel. "When your automated mortgage payments bounced, the bank demanded a lump sum payment of $120,000 to halt the foreclosure proceedings. You spent your last $2,000 renting those pathetic outfits, so you obviously missed the deadline." I stepped in this morning. I paid the bank in full and acquired the deed to the property. Richard opened the folder with trembling fingers. He stared at the legal transfer of title. The last bit of colour vanished from his face as the reality set in. I officially own the Connecticut estate now, I continued, maintaining eye contact with my father. And as the new owner, I am enforcing the exact same standards you established. You have exactly 48 hours to pack your things and get out of my house. Patricia let out a horrific shriek, covering her ears as if trying to physically block out my words. You can't do this, she wailed. Where will we go? We have no money, we have no credit. You'll figure it out, I said, perfectly mimicking the cold, detached tone Richard had used on me. You're adults. Don't act like you are the victims here. You were merely guests in a legacy that I actually built, and your welcome has officially expired. If I find a single scratch on the walls or so much as a piece of trash left behind, I will personally have my security team drag you into the street. Brittany continued to sob on the floor, rocking back and forth, completely unable to process the eviction order. Jamal sat frozen, his eyes wide and vacant. He knew he was going to prison, and now he knew he would be leaving his pregnant wife completely homeless in the process. I walked slowly around the edge of the table until I was standing directly beside Jamal. The arrogant financial broker who had tried to humiliate me was now a broken, sweating wreck. I reached into the pocket of my custom suit jacket. My fingers brushed against a piece of paper I had kept specifically for this exact moment. I pulled out a crisp but heavily creased $100 bill. It was the exact same bill Jamal had thrown onto my gravy-stained dinner plate. I held it up between two fingers, letting it catch the natural light pouring from the ocean windows. Jamal stared at the bill, a fresh wave of nausea washing over his face as he recognized it. Tell you what, Jamal, I said, my voice dripping with the exact same weaponized fake pity he had used against me. Because I'm a generous person, I'm going to throw you a lifeline. I know things are going to be incredibly tight for you now that your offshore portfolios have been seized by the federal government. And I know how difficult it can be to secure a moving company when you are facing a 15-year prison sentence. With a precise flick of my wrist, I dropped the $100 bill. It fluttered through the air, landing squarely on his lap, resting against the fabric of his rented Armani trousers. Use that to rent a U-Haul, I said, a sharp, victorious smile tugging at the corner of my lips. Or put a down payment on some cardboard boxes. Consider it an early Christmas gift from the successful side of the family. You're welcome. Jamal didn't reach for the $100. It lay on his lap, a mocking testament to his complete destruction. He simply stared at it, his chest heaving with shallow, panicked breaths. The manic energy that had filled the room earlier had completely drained away, replaced by a heavy, suffocating atmosphere. They were out of options. They were out of lies. They were completely out of time. I stepped back from his chair and walked calmly toward the main control panel, seamlessly integrated into the edge of the black marble table. I didn't look at a single one of them. The moment they handed me that eviction notice, they ceased to exist to me.